Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Snoozy Scientist, where we gently explore the mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. Whether you're resting beneath warm blankets, drifting in the stillness of night, or floating through that quiet space where thoughts begin to blur, you are exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we're traveling back 250 million years ago to a moment when Earth stood closer to becoming a silent planet than at any other time in its history. Scientists call this moment the Great Dying. About 90 to 95% of all species disappeared, creatures of the land, the sea, and the microscopic worlds between them. But what unsettles researchers most isn't the loss itself, it's the world that existed just before everything vanished. A world full of strange creatures, eerie landscapes, and ecosystems quietly pushed toward their limits. This wasn't the age of dinosaurs. They wouldn't appear for millions of years. The rulers of this time were older, stranger, and so alien that even the fiercest dinosaurs seem almost familiar by comparison. Imagine saber-toothed predators with mammal-like skulls, beaked herbivores built for endurance, and ancient reptiles shaped by climates that swung wildly between scorching heat and sudden chill. This was life teetering between survival and collapse. At this period, all the lands of Earth were still fused into a single immense landmass called Pangea, which stretched from horizon to horizon. It created blistering deserts in the interior and storms that tore across endless coastlines. Heat built up where the land was dry. Rainfall weakened. Temperatures rose to levels we can scarcely imagine. The oceans began to change, losing precious oxygen as their deeper waters turned still and dark. Yet life continued. It hunted, grazed, nested, and roamed, unaware of how fragile everything had become. From the outside, the planet still looked alive, but beneath the surface, the foundations were already cracking, preparing the way for one of the biggest catastrophes in Earth's history. So, what did Earth truly look like before almost everything vanished? And how could ecosystems that flourished for millions of years unravel so completely? Tonight, we are not rushing into the extinction itself. Instead, we are stepping softly into the world that came just before it, a world filled with motion and beauty, yet carrying the first quiet signs of unraveling. But before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into deep time, calm, curious, and filled with wonder, I'd love it if you gave this video a soft like and maybe tapped subscribe. It helps more dreamers find their way to this peaceful little corner of science. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and together, let's step softly into the world that existed before the Great Dying. Long before the skies dimmed and the world slid toward catastrophe, the surface of the earth carried a different shape. Continents that once drifted apart like islands on a restless ocean had slowly moved together, pressed by the slow force of shifting plates. Over millions of years, the pieces of the planet's crust pulled nearer and nearer until they finally touched. The result was a single landmass that filled almost half the globe. Scientists call it Pangea. It was one vast continent surrounded by one vast ocean, a world whose geography shaped every corner of life. To imagine Pangea, think of a puzzle, but with each piece pressed into place by the deep currents of the planet itself. The land stretched from pole to pole. Mountain ranges rose where continents collided, stacked high by the pressure of stone against stone. Shorelines formed a jagged outline that wrapped around the land like a thread. Inside this world, the interior of the continent was far from the sea. The oceans that once moderated temperature and rainfall were pushed to the edges. Without the stabilizing presence of water, the climate began to sharpen in ways that would soon test every living thing. Pangea was not a quiet or gentle place. Its size alone created forces that reshaped the climate. Air moved in sweeping currents across a landscape that stretched farther than any modern continent. Winds traveled without interruption, building storms that rumbled from one horizon to the other. The interior of the land grew fiercely hot beneath the ancient sun. Rain came less often, and when it did, it fell unevenly. Whole regions received no moisture for long stretches of time. Forests thinned, soil dried, and cracked beneath the heat. Even the rivers that had once been wide and strong began to shrink. The edges of the continent felt the ocean's touch. Sea breezes brought cooler days and more rain, but as one traveled deeper inland, the sky changed. The air became still and dry. The distance from the sea made the land more sensitive to heat. Temperatures swung sharply between day and night. Summers burned. Winters cut cold. The land became a place of extremes, shaped by the size of the continent itself. Life adapted to survive, but the balance was delicate. In the outer rim of Pangea, where the winds carried sea air inland, forests took root. Plants reached high into the sky. Creatures found shade beneath their branches and drank from streams that slid between ancient roots. These places were vibrant and complex, filled with relationships that felt strong and enduring, yet they were fragile in a way that few could see. The stability of these ecosystems depended on a climate that changed with surprising ease. Farther inland, beyond the reach of the rain and the shade, the world took on a different form. The land flattened into broad plains. Deserts spread across the heart of the continent. Sand dunes rolled with the wind. The sun beat down on the ground and dried the air until it shimmered with heat. Creatures that lived here had to be resilient. They possessed bodies built for survival in harsh conditions. They hunted and grazed across empty stretches of land where water was scarce and shelter was limited. Pangea created a world of contrasts. Along its coasts, life flourished. Inland, the world was harsher. The distance between these places was not measured in miles, but in the slow changes of temperature and the steady drying of air. The very shape of the continent set the stage for life's struggle. Forests gave way to plains. Plains gave way to deserts. Each region bordered another, yet each carried its own challenges. The creatures that lived there adapted in subtle ways. They grew thicker skins. They learned to travel farther for food and water. Their bodies changed to match the world around them. But even in the most vibrant forests and along the richest riverbanks, the stability could not last forever. The size of Pangea made the world sensitive to change. The planet's climate shifted in cycles that grew more unpredictable as time passed. Seasons stretched into long periods of drought or sudden storms. The fragile balance between life and the environment was easily disturbed. When temperatures rose or rainfall declined, the ecosystems began to strain. What made Pangea so remarkable was not only its size, but the way it carried both possibility and risk. A single continent meant that species could travel across vast distances. Predators followed their prey through open land. Plants spread their seeds across plains and valleys, but this mobility came with a cost. When the climate shifted, there was nowhere else to go. The sea was distant. The extremes of the land were difficult to escape. Ecosystems that looked strong and enduring could be pushed into collapse with astonishing speed. The shape of the earth had created a world both powerful and fragile. Pangea held forests and deserts, rivers and mountains, life and drought. It held promise and danger in equal measure. The continent itself was a force that shaped the future, guiding the lives of countless species. Yet it was also a quiet warning. When the environment changed, the balance could break, and in the heart of that vast land, where the sun burned hottest and the rivers ran thin, the world was already shifting in ways that would soon affect everything that lived. As Pangea settled into its monumental shape, the earth beneath it continued to change. The climate that once carried a balance between warmth and coolness began to shift. The signs were subtle at first, scattered across the planet in ways that only the passage of deep time would reveal. But with each passing millennia, these changes grew stronger, pulling the world toward a future that slowly unfolded beneath the feet of every creature living on that ancient land. Global temperatures were rising. It was not a sudden rush of heat, but a slow and steady climb. The world warmed by degrees so small that life had time to adjust in tiny steps. Plants stretched deeper roots to search for water. Animals migrated farther in search of cooler places. Rivers carved new channels as rainfall patterns weakened. The land changed with the sky, shaping itself in response to the warming of the air. Scientists today can read these changes in rocks and sediments. Certain minerals form only when the climate is hotter. The colors of ancient soil speak the language of heat. Even fossilized tree rings reveal seasons that grew warmer and more unpredictable. Each one is a message from a world that was beginning to tilt into a different kind of climate. The warming did not spread evenly across the surface. The interior of Pangea felt it first. The vast distance from the ocean meant that moisture could not travel inland as easily. Without the cooling presence of rain and sea breezes, the land grew dry beneath the sun. Grass and shrubs that once grew thick across the ground began to thin. Over long ages, what was once fertile territory shifted into barren stretches of earth. Rainfall that had once followed familiar paths began to weaken. Storm clouds formed less often. When the rain did fall, it did not last long. Rivers that once flowed wide and strong slowed into thin lines of water. Some disappeared entirely as the weather patterns changed. The landscape transformed into a mosaic of dryness and heat. Forests that had stood for generations withered beneath the changing climate. The deserts expanded. They crept slowly outward, grain by grain, day by day. Sand dunes swallowed valleys and plains. What had once been a thriving region, filled with plants and animals, became a sea of shifting sand and wind. The heat was not just an external force. It settled into the ground, reshaping the soil and the life above it. Fossils show animals that attempted to adapt their bodies to the new climate, creatures growing thicker skin or developing ways to survive longer without water. These changes might seem distant and slow, but they left a clear mark on the planet. The continents continued to move. Volcanic activity released gases that filled the sky. The atmosphere shifted in composition. Carbon dioxide rose slowly, trapping heat and pushing the planet into a warmer state. The air itself was no longer the same. Scientists studying ancient rocks and trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere have found evidence of these changes etched directly into the earth. What makes this time so compelling is not how quickly the world changed, but how steadily. The transformation took place over millions of years, yet every creature living through it experienced that change as a quiet pressure. Plants grew differently, animals migrated farther, the world adapted in small ways, responding to the warming climate even as the future carried far greater changes. As deserts grew larger, they reshaped the movement of animals across the continent. Herds that once traveled through forests now crossed open sands and dry plains. The heat created new environments that had not existed before. Ancient rivers carved into the land and became the final sources of water for creatures pushed away from their old habitats. Some species found ways to thrive. Others faded quietly as the world continued to warm. The atmosphere was shifting too. The delicate mixture of gases that supported life began to change. New elements appeared in the air, carried by volcanic eruptions and deep shifts within the Earth. The sky was becoming a warning that the planet was nearing a threshold, not yet a catastrophe, just the first gentle steps toward one. Scientists today can see that these changes were early red flags. The slow rise in temperature, the weakening rainfall, the expanding deserts, the shift in the composition of the atmosphere. Every one of these events contributed to a planet drifting toward instability, even though life continued to move through its routines. The creatures of the Permian world adapted because they had no choice. The Earth was changing around them, and they lived within that change. The climate of the Permian was a quiet force. It did not roar or strike suddenly. It shifted the world piece by piece. Heat rose through the land, water pulled away from the interior. The atmosphere took on a new character. This slow transformation would shape every living thing on Earth, guiding the ancient world toward a future that was already taking hold in the warmth of the air. As the Earth continued its quiet drift toward heat, life adapted in ways that echoed the changing world. The forests, plains, and drying river valleys were not empty. They were shaped by powerful predators that watched from the shadows and moved silently across the land. Long before the first dinosaur ever grew teeth or lifted its head to the wind, a different lineage of hunters ruled the continent. Their bodies carried the story of an ancient world, shaped by forces that were already pulling the planet in a new direction. Among these hunters was a creature that has left a deep memory in the fossil record: the Gorgonopsids. They walked on four strong legs and held a long, narrow skull lined with curved sabers. Their teeth were not like those of modern cats or wolves. They were longer and shaped for slicing, made for bringing down prey with a single bite. Their bodies were lean and muscular, built for fast movement. The shape of their bones shows that they could spring forward in quick bursts of speed. Their eyes faced forward, giving them a clear view of the world before them and allowing them to track the movement of their prey with precision. The Gorgonopsids were the apex predators of the Permian world. Their dominance did not come from brute force alone. It came from a combination of agility, intelligence, and instinct. They stalked their prey across open plains and through dry forests. Each step they took was calculated and careful. They could follow scent trails left on the wind or in the dust. Their bodies were designed for endurance. They could walk for long distances, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When a Gorgonopsid hunted, it did not rely on large packs or complex strategies. It did not need many others to help. It hunted alone or in small groups, relying on its strength and its long sabers. One well-placed bite could stop an animal in its tracks. The muscles in its neck and shoulders were strong enough to pull down even large plant eaters. Once the prey fell, the Gorgonopsid tore into the flesh with powerful jaws and sharp teeth. Its feeding left marks that scientists can still see in fossilized bone. Clean slices where the sabers cut through skin and muscle. This world was already under pressure from the changing climate. Water was harder to find in some regions. Plants had begun to thin. Prey animals had to travel farther for food. Predators had to follow them. The Gorgonopsids lived within this changing environment. Their bodies carried the signs of the stress that was spreading through the land. They had to adapt to a world where prey moved through more open spaces and through landscapes that had once held thicker forests. Because of this, their hunting methods were shaped by scarcity. They did not waste effort. They did not rush. They watched the world with a quiet patience. Their bodies were built not just for the kill, but for the long wait before it. The Gorgonopsids were unlike any predator alive today. They were not mammals or reptiles in the way we know them. They belonged to an older branch of life. Their bones and teeth show a mixture of features that do not fit neatly into modern categories. They were early relatives of the line that would one day lead to mammals, yet they still carried traits that we associate with reptiles. They were a living bridge between ancient forms and what would come later. Their dominance shaped the ecosystems of the Permian. Where they hunted, other creatures learned to fear the open ground. Herbivores kept to the edges of forests or near the last remaining sources of water. The presence of an apex predator changes the patterns of an environment. It affects how plants grow and where animals travel. The Gorgonopsids held the land in a balance, even as the world around them shifted toward a hotter and drier future. But this balance was not secure. The same forces that pushed the climate toward heat also reshaped the lives of these predators. As water continued to disappear from the interior, the prey that once fed the Gorgonopsids moved into smaller regions. The predators had to travel farther. They faced competition from other species. The environment that had once supported their strength and dominance began to weaken beneath them. The disappearance of the Gorgonopsids marks one of the turning points in Earth's history. Their loss was a sign that the world was stepping into another stage. It was not sudden, it happened slowly, but the effect was profound. Without these powerful predators, the balance of life shifted again. Other creatures took their place. The ancient landscapes that had been shaped by the presence of the Gorgonopsids began to change. Their extinction tells a story of a planet beginning to fall out of harmony. It shows how even the strongest and most adaptable species can be pushed beyond their limits. The fossils they left behind carry the memory of a world that was full of movement and life, a world that was beginning to face the first quiet tremors of the future that would one day unfold across the land. The Gorgonopsids were the rulers of the Permian world. They walked across a planet that was already changing. Their presence was a testament to what life can become when it adapts to the demands of its time. And their disappearance was a reminder that even the most powerful creatures cannot escape the slow and steady force of a planet drifting into heat. As the great predators watched the land from the shadows and stalked their prey across a warming earth, another type of creature carried its own story through this ancient world. Not hunters, but herbivores. They shaped the land in quieter ways, and their bodies held early clues about the changes unfolding around them. These were animals that grazed along shrinking rivers, wandered the open plains, and fed on plants that fought to survive in the shifting climate. They did not rule the land through teeth and speed. They survived through patience, endurance, and an ancient resilience. Among them were the Dicynodonts, a strange and impressive group that walked across the continent with a slow and steady gait. Their faces carried a beak instead of the familiar rows of teeth we see today. The beak was strong and curved, built for slicing into tough plants. Their bodies were broad and sturdy, held up by strong legs that allowed them to travel far for food and water. Some were the size of small cattle, others were no larger than modern pigs. Despite their differences in size, they shared a common form that made them instantly recognizable in the fossil record. The beak of the Dicynodont was more than just a feeding tool, it was an adaptation to a changing world. Plants had grown tougher as the climate shifted. Leaves became thicker and more fibrous as water became scarce. The Dicynodonts evolved to handle these challenges. Their jaws were powered by strong muscles that could bite through hard stems and dry leaves. They were perfectly suited for a world where food was no longer soft or easy to chew. They lived in herds, moving together across the land in search of vegetation. Each step they took stirred dust from the ground. Their movements shaped the landscape, just as the predators did. They created paths through forests and grasslands. They left behind trails that other species followed. Their presence helped maintain the balance of the ecosystems that still held together across the continent. Not all herbivores were as large or as slow as the Dicynodonts. One of the most remarkable was the Lystrosaurus. This creature carried a shape that scientists believe helped it survive where others did not. Its body was small and compact, with strong forelimbs that allowed it to dig for roots and buried plants. Its face carried the same beak-like structure as other Dicynodonts, but the Lystrosaurus had an unusual flexibility in its body and limbs. It could move easily across different environments, from riverbanks to open plains. The Lystrosaurus was built for survival. Its sturdy frame helped it endure long periods of drought. Its broad lungs and efficient breathing likely allowed it to handle dusty air and thinner oxygen. When other animals struggled to adapt, the Lystrosaurus continued forward. Fossil evidence shows that it became one of the most common animals on Earth during the late Permian period. It lived in regions where the environment was already beginning to break. It moved through landscapes shaped by drought, heat, and the shifting climate. The bones of these herbivores carry messages from a world in transition. Scientists have studied the patterns in their growth and the marks left by stress and scarcity. Many fossils show signs of interrupted growth, where periods of abundance were followed by times of hunger. Bone rings that should be smooth are broken into uneven bands. These patterns tell a story of animals that faced repeated cycles of difficulty, times when water was scarce, seasons when plants did not grow. In some places, skeletons of Dicynodonts and Lystrosaurus are found grouped together, suggesting mass deaths during droughts or sudden environmental changes. These fossils speak quietly of a world that was already nearing the edge. Before the final collapse, there were early hints, not dramatic ones, but subtle signs of strain. Bones grew thinner during dry years. Teeth wore down faster from tough vegetation. The animals survived, but not without cost. These herbivores lived with the slow changes around them. They moved through landscapes that carried the first signs of decline. Their bodies tell us that even before the oceans darkened and the atmosphere shifted further, the land was showing cracks in its foundation. These signs were not immediate or violent. They built up over long stretches of time. The herbivores adapted because they were resilient. They continued to graze and wander, shaping their world as the environment continued to drift toward heat and dryness. For a moment in Earth's history, these creatures flourished. They filled the land with life, becoming part of the landscape and the quiet story of survival. Their bones carry the memory of that era. They hold the marks of a world that was still alive, but already changing in ways that would lead to a future no creature could predict. They were the quiet giants of the Permian. They were the survivors of a world beginning to fail. Through their fossils, we can still hear the soft echoes of that ancient time. As the creatures of the land moved across the warming earth and grazed through the last stable pockets of green, the forests around them carried an ancient silence. These forests were powerful forces of life long before the climate began to shift. They covered vast regions of the continent, growing across valleys and mountains and stretching into the distance where the sky met the ground. The trees reached high into the air, their branches spread wide, creating shadows that cooled the earth below. Yet even in these early moments of change, the forests were already beginning to reflect the pressures of a shifting world. The late Permian forests were unlike any landscape we would recognize today. They were filled with towering conifers that rose toward the sky, some as tall as small buildings. Their trunks were thick and strong. Their roots reached deep into the ground, searching for rest, water, and nutrients. They stood in quiet clusters, forming shaded corridors, where smaller plants and young trees grew beneath their branches. The air smelled of sap and resin. The needles that covered the trees rustled softly in the wind. In some regions, the forests were made up of glossopteris trees. These trees carried broad leaves that spread out like fans, capturing sunlight for energy and growth. The leaves fell to the forest floor and created thick layers of plant matter. Over millions of years, these layers would become the coal seams that reveal their presence today. The cotted, Glossopteris forests were ancient and strong. They were part of an ecosystem that had developed slowly over time, balancing water, light, and temperature. But the forests were not untouched by the forces that were changing the land. The air around them held less moisture. The wind carried more heat. The rainfall did not come as often as it once did. The Glossopteris trees began to show signs of stress in their leaves and branches. The conifers that had stretched high into the sky faced the same challenges. Their roots reached deeper into the ground, but the water was becoming harder to find. Ancient plants adapted to survive long periods of dryness. They changed their leaves to reduce water loss. They grew thicker bark to protect themselves from heat and wind. Some developed cones and seeds that could travel farther on the air, seeking new regions where the climate might be more forgiving. These adaptations were small and gradual. They were part of the slow rhythm of nature that had shaped life on Earth for countless generations. Yet the climate continued to shift. The rising temperatures created new patterns in the world. The forests that had once stood strong began to weaken. The Glossopteris trees no longer grew with the same height or strength. Their leaves grew smaller. Their roots became more exposed as the soil dried. The conifers that had towered above the landscape began to show signs of decline. Branches broke under their own weight. The sap that flowed through their trunks became thicker and darker. Scientists can see these changes in the fossils left behind. The growth rings of ancient trees show periods where the climate was dry or hot. The structure of the wood reveals times when the trees struggled to survive. Some fossils show trees that lived through repeated droughts, each one leaving a mark in the pattern of the wood. The forests were fighting to endure, but the challenges were growing ever more difficult. Seedlings that once grew in shaded valleys now faced open sun and dry soil. Streams that had carried water to the roots of the trees became narrow and shallow. The deeper the roots reached, the more the soil resisted. The forest floor dried and hardened. The balance between growth and decay began to shift. Where there had once been lush undergrowth, there were now gaps in the vegetation. Light filtered through spaces where trees had fallen. The Glossopteris forests were among the first to show signs of collapse. Their broad leaves required steady access to water. Without it, the trees could not maintain their structure or stability. The conifers held on longer because of their thick bark and deep roots, but even they began to falter as the environment changed faster than they could adapt. The forests that had once anchored the landscape were becoming fragile. The failure of these forests did not happen in a single moment. It was a slow unraveling. One tree would weaken, another would fall. The spaces left behind created openings for wind and heat to enter. The roots that once held soil in place loosened their grip. Soil that had been protected from erosion was now exposed to the elements. The forests began to thin and retreat. The collapse of the forests marked a turning point in the relationship between land and life. Plants that had once shaped the climate and provided shelter for countless species were now struggling to survive. Their adaptation had limits. The atmosphere was changing faster than the ancient systems could handle. The forests that had been strong and expansive became fragile and fragmented. What remains of these forests are the fossils and the deep layers of coal that still lie beneath the ground. They are reminders of a world that once flourished. They speak of trees that reached toward the sky and struggled to adapt as the climate shifted beneath their roots. The late Permian forests were powerful, yet they were shaped by forces greater than their strength. They tried to endure, but the world around them was already slipping into a new era of change. Above the forests that strained for water and the plains that stretched beneath the ancient sun, the sky began to shift in ways that were almost invisible at first. The atmosphere had always been a protective blanket around the earth, a mixture of gases that made life possible. For millions of years, it held just enough oxygen for plants and animals to thrive, just enough to keep the balance steady. But as the climate warmed and the continents settled into their new positions, the air itself began to change. The level of oxygen in the atmosphere slowly declined. It was not a sudden drop, it happened gradually, over long spans of time. Plants and trees still released oxygen through their leaves and needles, but the forests had already begun to weaken. They could not keep pace with the shifts in the Earth's systems. Less moisture, higher temperatures, and stress on the land all reduced the amount of oxygen that plants returned to the air. Bit by bit, the air grew thinner. For the animals that lived during this time, these changes were not always obvious. A single breath still felt like a breath, but inside their bodies, the lungs and blood began to work differently. Fossils show that many animals developed larger chest cavities or more efficient breathing passages, subtle signs of life adjusting to an atmosphere that was becoming harder to breathe. Each inhale carried slightly less oxygen than the one before. The world began to feel heavier, as if the air held a quiet weight that was slowly increasing. As the air changed, the land reflected these shifts. Wildfires began sweeping across the vast regions that had once been forests or grasslands. The dryness of the plants created perfect fuel. Lightning storms sparked flames that spread across the open land. Fire traveled quickly through the undergrowth, racing across dried branches and brittle leaves. In some places, the fire burned low to the ground. In others, the flames rose tall and bright against the dark sky. These wildfires left marks that can still be seen today. Layers of ancient charcoal appear in the geological record. They are thin, dark bands preserved in rocks and sediment, evidence of fires that burned hotter and more often than before. This charcoal is a message from the past. It tells us how the sky and land interacted. The air became dry and warm enough to support large fires, feeding on the changing plant life. The forests were no longer strong enough to resist the flames. Alongside the wildfires came dust storms. These storms rolled across the deserts and plains, stirred by winds that moved without resistance across the wide land of Pangaea. The soil had lost its stability as plants weakened and rivers dried. The dust carried with it small particles of earth, lifted into the air and carried for long distances. These particles settled into layers that still lie beneath the surface today. Each layer is a record of the storms that swept across the land, a memory of a world where the ground and air had begun to trade places. Dust storms changed the color of the sky. They filled the air with a haze that filtered the sunlight and reduced visibility. In some places, the dust fell like ash over the land. In others, it mixed with rain and created thick mud that covered the ground. The movement of dust across the surface of the earth was a sign that the land itself was becoming unstable. Soil that had once been held in place by strong roots now drifted in the wind. These environmental changes connected directly to the air that life depended on. The atmosphere was becoming a different kind of space. Oxygen levels continued to drop, and scientists believe that the air contained more carbon dioxide than before. This gas trapped heat in the atmosphere. It changed the way the earth reflected sunlight and absorbed warmth. The world grew warmer beneath this altered sky. Plants and animals responded to the new air in their own ways. Some species developed tougher skin to protect against dryness. Others changed their breathing patterns. The organisms that lived in water felt the changes too. Oxygen dissolved in streams and lakes, became more limited. Aquatic plants and small animals were forced into shallower waters where the levels were more stable. The changing air was not only a scientific shift, it was an environment that shaped the experience of life. With less oxygen, movement required more effort. The temperature of the planet rose. The relationship between land and sky changed in ways that affected every living thing. The atmosphere that had once supported the vast forests and powerful predators now carried signs of stress in its very composition. Over time, these signals became clearer. The air held less of what life needed. The fires burned more fiercely. The dust storms carried the memory of weakened soil and drying forests. The sky that had once seemed limitless began to show its own strain. It was becoming a space that reflected the earth below it. The balance that had sustained life for millions of years was beginning to falter, and the atmosphere held quiet signs of the world that lay ahead. Even as the forests weakened and the air grew thinner and warmer, the rivers still held their ancient pulse. They moved across the surface of the land with a steady rhythm, carrying water from the higher mountains to the lower plains. Their banks were shaped by time. Their currents carved channels through rock and soil. In a world where deserts expanded and wildfires swept across the land, the rivers remained a refuge for life. The rivers survived longer than the forests for many reasons. They were fed by underground springs and melting snows from distant highlands. When the rain failed to come and the soil dried beneath the sun, the rivers continued to flow with the memory of water stored deep within the earth. They held on to moisture in a world that was slowly losing its ability to sustain life. Their currents offered coolness and stability. Their channels provided shelter from the heat and dryness that had begun to spread across the land. Along these rivers, ecosystems continued to thrive. Plants grew along the banks, reaching their roots into the moist soil. Some species developed long tendrils that clung to the water's edge. They drew strength from the steady flow, absorbing nutrients and moisture. These plants created shade that protected small animals from the sun. They offered shelter and food in a landscape that was beginning to show signs of stress. Animals followed the rivers too. Amphibians were among the most common inhabitants of these watery refuges. They moved between land and water with a quiet grace, slipping into the currents to cool their bodies or to escape the heat. Their skin absorbed moisture directly from the water. They depended on the rivers for survival, using them as a source of hydration and a place to lay their eggs. Early reptile-like species lived along the rivers as well. These creatures carried the ancient traits of their ancestors, but with new adaptations that allowed them to survive in a changing world. They had scales that protected their bodies from dryness. Their lungs were well developed. They could move across land more easily than the amphibians that shared the waters with them. They hunted for insects or small fish along the riverbanks, using the water as both habitat and hunting ground. The rivers also drew larger animals. Some grazed on the plants that grew along the banks. Others traveled long distances to drink from the cool waters. Predators followed the movement of prey to these rivers, waiting for the right moment to strike. The rivers formed a network of life that still pulsed even as the forests failed. They were the last stable environments in a world that was beginning to fragment beneath the pressure of a changing climate. But even the rivers were not untouched by the forces that shaped the earth during the Late Permian. The river levels began to fall as droughts became more common. The water grew warmer, the flow slowed. In places, the currents became shallow or broke apart into a series of pools. The riverbanks dried and cracked. The plants that had once grown thick and green began to wither. These drought cycles pushed the river ecosystems to their limits. When the water receded, Amphibians struggled to find new places to lay their eggs. Their skin dried quickly beneath the sun. They depended on the moisture of the riverbanks and the shade provided by overhanging plants. When these disappeared, they had fewer places to hide or to hunt. Some species developed ways to burrow into the muddy banks, waiting for the water to return. Others migrated to deeper channels in search of shelter. Early reptile-like creatures faced their own challenges. They could survive longer without water than amphibians, but they still needed access to the rivers. Their journeys across the land were more dangerous as the climate continued to shift. Some found isolated pools that held water longer than the main channels. These pools became temporary oases in the drying land. They gathered around these pockets of moisture, creating small communities that continued to live even during the hardest times. The rivers also held the remains of animals that did not survive. Fossils found in ancient riverbeds show skeletons of creatures that perished during periods of drought. Some died near the banks as they tried to reach the last sources of water. Others were carried downstream by the weakened current. The riverbeds preserve these records. They tell a story of life trying to endure despite the challenges of a changing world. The river ecosystems survived longer than the forests because they were connected to deeper sources of water. They were able to replenish themselves even when the rain failed. But over time, the drought cycles became more severe. The rivers grew narrower and more shallow. The plants that grew along their banks struggled to maintain their strength. The animals that depended on the rivers faced increasing hardships. Still, the rivers remained a symbol of persistence. They carried the last signs of life across the file. Land. Their waters reflected the sky above them, even as the atmosphere changed and the land around them shifted. The rivers were a lifeline in a world that was becoming more difficult to navigate. They held the memory of a time when the earth was full of water and life flourished along their banks. As the climate continued to change, the rivers carried that memory forward, one quiet moment at a time. While rivers carried the last threads of life across the interior of the land, a different story began unfolding across the ancient seas. The oceans had once been a place of calm stability, a world that changed slowly and provided a reliable rhythm for the creatures that lived beneath the surface. For millions of years, the waters circulated warmth and nutrients across long distances, supporting vibrant ecosystems that flourished from the coastlines to the deepest trenches. But as the world above shifted into drought and heat, the oceans began to change as well. The first signs appeared deep, beneath the surface, where sunlight could not reach. The oxygen levels in the deeper waters began to decline. In a healthy ocean, currents carry oxygen from the surface down into the depths, allowing a variety of species to survive. Cold water sinks and mixes with warmer layers, spreading oxygen and supporting life at every level. But the warming climate slowed these movements. The currents that once flowed steadily through the ocean became weaker. The deeper waters received less and less oxygen. At first, the animals that lived in these depths adjusted. Many species had evolved to survive. With lower oxygen levels, their bodies could extract as much as possible from the surrounding water. But as the oxygen continued to decline, these natural adaptations were pushed to their limits. Some species began to migrate toward the surface. Others stayed where they were, unable to move, and slowly perished in the increasingly lifeless depths. These low oxygen areas became zones where life could barely survive. Scientists call them dead zones. They formed slowly at first, then expanded as the ocean continued to warm. The once vibrant ecosystems in the deep water became quieter. Fish and invertebrates that had lived there for millions of years disappeared from the fossil record. Their absence marks the growing difficulty of life in the ocean's interior. As the deeper waters suffocated, the warmer currents near the surface increased in temperature. The warm water held less oxygen than cooler water, making the problem even worse. The warmth spread across the ancient seas, changing the habitats of countless species. Coral-like organisms that had once anchored the ecosystems began to weaken. These early corals had built reefs that supported life in the shallow waters. They provided shelter, food, and complex environments where countless organisms lived together in balance. But coral is sensitive to temperature. As the water warmed, these corals became stressed. They lost their ability to support the organisms that depended on them. The ancient reefs began to crumble and decline. They no longer provided the safety and stability that had once been central to life in the shallows. The warming currents spread across the ocean floor, touching every corner of the sea. The loss of coral-like ecosystems had wide-reaching effects. The small organisms that lived among the coral could no longer rely on the reefs for shelter. Larger animals that fed on these small creatures found themselves seeking new sources of food. The delicate chain of life in the ocean began to unravel. Each change pushed another species to adapt, migrate, or disappear. With the deep waters becoming too dangerous and the reefs beginning to fail, life started moving toward the shallow coastal regions. These waters still held enough oxygen to support a variety of species. Sunlight reached the sea floor in these areas. Plants and algae had enough energy to grow. Small fish and invertebrates gathered in these habitats, taking advantage of the resources that remained. The shallow waters became a refuge. They were a place where life could still flourish, even as the deeper waters darkened. These coastal refuges became crowded. Creatures that had once lived far apart were now pressed together. Their numbers increased in small areas, creating competition for space and food. Yet they continued to live there, drawn by the relative safety compared to the rest of the ocean. The refugees of the sea gathered near the coast, and these ecosystems carried the memory of a time when the ocean was full of vibrant life from top to bottom. The surface of the sea also changed. The color of the water shifted as algae and other microorganisms grew in the warmer conditions. In some places, these blooms created patches of green or brown. They changed the way sunlight penetrated the surface became a mirror that reflected the sky in new shades of blue and silver, depending on the time of day and the movement of the waves. The oceans were darkening, not only in color, but in the stability and life they had once offered. The deeper waters were becoming inhospitable. The coral-like ecosystems were weakening. The warm currents that once carried nutrients across the sea were now contributing to the decline of life. The shallow coastal refuges became the last stronghold for many species, a place where they could survive the changes that were gripping the ocean. These shifts in the ocean were part of the larger story of a world drifting into uncertainty. They revealed how the balance of life and climate was beginning to tilt. The ancient seas that had once supported countless creatures were becoming less welcoming. The oceans held their own challenges and mysteries, and they carried the early signs of a future that would reach across the entire planet. Deep within the oceans that were already beginning to show the first signs of strain, an even quieter transformation unfolded. It did not reveal itself through giant footprints or fallen trees. It did not roar like the ancient predators or sweep across the land like wildfires. It moved through the water in silence, carried by the smallest forms of life on Earth. These were the microbes, drifting through the ancient seas in unimaginable numbers. They were older than any forest or creature that walked on land. They had survived every previous age and every shift in climate. Now they were beginning to take a new form of control. As the oceans warmed and circulation slowed, these microscopic beings found themselves in a different world. The deeper water no longer carried the cool currents that once spread oxygen across the seafloor. Instead, the warm surface water created barriers that separated deep and shallow layers. The deeper waters grew still and dark. They became places where life changed at the smallest scale. Microbes that had once been part of the quiet background of the ocean began to multiply. Some of these microorganisms were simple bacteria that thrived on low oxygen. They spread across the ocean floor in thin blankets, consuming what little oxygen remained. The more they grew, the less oxygen was left for the larger organisms that had ruled the deep waters for millions of years. The ancient fish and invertebrates that had lived in these depths found themselves competing with a force they could not see. These microbes were perfectly suited to the changing environment. They adapted quickly, multiplying in the spaces where oxygen was disappearing. Among them were methane-producing bacteria. They thrived in the warmer, more stagnant waters. They fed on the chemical compounds that drifted through the deep layers of the ocean. As they consumed this material, they released methane into the water and into the atmosphere. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. Even in small amounts, it traps heat. The presence of these bacteria created pockets of Oceanic and warmth in the deep ocean. Over long stretches of time, this warmth spread to the surface and added to the warming of the planet. This shift in the ocean's chemistry did not happen overnight. It was a slow and gradual process, like so many of the changes that shaped the late Permian world. Layer by layer, the microbes spread. They formed mats across the seafloor. They filled the spaces between rocks and sediments. Their presence changed the balance of the ocean in subtle but powerful ways. As the bacteria spread and grew more active, the chemical makeup of the ocean water changed. Hydrogen sulfide began to form in deeper regions of the sea. Hydrogen sulfide is a toxic gas that can be deadly to most forms of complex life. It creates an environment where only certain microbes can survive. These gases formed in small areas at first, but over time, they created thin layers that covered larger and larger portions of the ocean floor. Scientists believe that these layers may have glowed faintly in the dark waters. The chemical reactions between the microbes and the seawater produced compounds that emitted a pale light. If one could have seen these ancient seas from within, the depths might have appeared as ghostly underwater plains, dotted with glowing patches of microbial life. These microbial changes were more dangerous than any predator that walked on land or swam in the sea. Predators act on individual animals. They hunt a single creature at a time. Microbes change the entire environment. They alter the basic conditions that all life depends on. As the levels of hydrogen sulfide increased, the ocean became less hospitable to the plants and animals that relied on oxygen. Entire ecosystems began to shift as the chemical balance of the water continued to change. The presence of methane creating bacteria made the air above the ocean warmer and more unstable. The hydrogen sulfide created pockets of toxicity that could drift toward the surface. The oceans were no longer simple bodies of water. They had become complex chemical systems shaped by the smallest forms of life. The creatures that lived during this time had no way to predict these changes. The predators on land and sea could not find or fight this invisible threat. Herbivores could not flee from it. Even the strongest trees and the most resilient animals could not protect themselves from the slow transformation unfolding beneath the waves. These microbial revolutions reveal something important about the ancient world. A planet can be shaped not only by the giant creatures that roam across its surface or the dramatic forces of earthquakes and volcanoes. It can also be transformed by the smallest organisms that drift in the water and cling to the ocean floor. Their invisible work can reshape entire environments and set the stage for events that unfold on a scale far larger than any one creature. In the late Permian oceans, The microbes were changing the chemistry of the sea and the atmosphere above it. They were creating a world where the balance of life would tilt in a new direction. Long before the final moments of the Great Dying, the smallest forms of life were quietly rewriting the future of the earth, one breath of the ocean at a time. Beneath the rivers that held the final threads of life, and below the seas where invisible armies of microbes were shifting the chemistry of the water, the earth was leaving messages in stone. These messages were not written in language or symbols. They were written in the fragments of shells, the shape of broken bones, and the quiet absence of species that once filled the land and water. The fossil record holds these traces like pages in a book that was never meant to be written for human eyes. Yet it carries the history of the world more patiently than any living witness. The first warnings did not appear as global extinctions or sudden collapses. They appeared as small vanishings. In the shallow layers of sediment that settled at the bottoms of rivers and lakes, and in the sediment that gathered on the floors of ancient seas, paleontologists find evidence that certain species began disappearing from one region at a time. These absences are like missing notes in a long song. A creature that had once been common in the area suddenly vanished, replaced by gaps in the record or by species that were more resilient to the changing conditions. At first, these vanishings were scattered. A type of shellfish might disappear from one coastline while continuing to survive elsewhere. A species of amphibian might vanish from a river system where the drought had deepened, even as it held on in another region with more abundant water. These changes suggest that the collapse of the Permian world did not begin everywhere at the same moment. It started locally, in regions where the balance had already begun to fail. Over time, these disappearances grew more frequent. In some layers of rock, fossils are found in patterns that suggest repeated die-offs. Large numbers of organisms perished in short periods of geological time. Above them, another layer shows that life returned. New generations of species filled the space left behind. But the recovery was brief. Another die-off followed. These repeated patterns are preserved in the fossil record like waves moving through sand. Each wave marks the beginning and end of a cycle of life and loss. Many of these fossils show stress markers. Shells that once grew in symmetrical spirals show cracks and deformities. Their growth lines, which normally form even rings, are irregular or narrowly spaced. They reflect times when food was scarce or when the water held too little oxygen. In bones, paleontologists find signs of slowed growth, weak structure, or changes in the mineral composition. These changes reveal that the creatures were living in conditions that forced them to adapt to a world that was becoming more unpredictable. These stress markers are not dramatic in appearance. They are subtle changes in the shape of a shell or the texture of bone, yet they carry the memory of an ancient environment that forced life to work harder for survival. They tell us that the creatures were not simply dying. They were struggling to continue, adjusting their bodies to conditions that no longer supported the balance that had existed for millions of years. Some fossils reveal even more startling signs. In regions that once held coral-like ecosystems, scientists find layers where the shells of ancient organisms are replaced by minerals that indicate a sudden shift in ocean chemistry. These minerals can only form in environments where the oxygen levels have fallen below a critical threshold. The bones and shells are replaced by iron-rich compounds or minerals created by hydrogen sulfide. These fossils paint a picture of environments collapsing from the bottom up, as tiny creatures that formed the base of the food chain disappeared. The way paleontologists uncover these patterns is itself a quiet kind of science. They examine the layers of sediment like chapters in a story. Each layer represents a moment in time, a tiny piece of the Earth's long memory. By comparing layers from different parts of the world, scientists can see the first hints of regional collapses. They identify which species disappeared first and which ones held on the longest. They trace the movement of life across continents and oceans as species sought refuge from the changing climate. In some places, the fossil record shows a sudden drop in biodiversity. The layers contain fewer species, fewer shells, fewer bones. In others, it reveals pockets of life moving to new regions or clinging to small areas where conditions remain stable for a little longer. These patterns tell a story of an ecosystem that was beginning to stretch and fragment. Life was still present, but it was no longer evenly distributed. It was beginning to gather in smaller and smaller patches. The fossils also record moments of recovery. After each regional die-off, new species emerged. They filled the empty spaces and adapted to the new conditions. These cycles of collapse and renewal continued for tens of thousands of years. But with each cycle, the world grew more fragile. The record shows that the ecosystems were slowly losing their ability to rebound. The Earth was changing quietly, layer by layer. The fossil record is proof that long before the Great Dying reached its full shadow across the world, life was already feeling the strain. The bones, shells, and sediments tell us that these early signs were written into the world itself. They are reminders that even the strongest systems can falter when every element of the environment begins to shift, one silent step at a time. As the fossil record began to reveal the first disappearances of ancient species and the oceans carried hidden signs of chemical change, the world above continued shifting in ways that touched every corner of the planet. The Earth was no longer the steady and predictable world it had been for so long. The climate that once followed a familiar rhythm was beginning to lose its balance. The seasons that shaped the lives of plants and animals started to drift from their old patterns. In earlier ages, the turning of seasons provided a gentle structure for life. Rains arrived when they were needed. Temperatures changed in a cadence that was understood by every creature that walked or flew or swam, but now these patterns were becoming harder to predict. Some years, the rains would fall early. Other years, they would not come at all. Winters became warmer in regions that had always known cold. Summers stretched longer across the land. The changes were not dramatic at first. They were like small missteps in a dance that had never faltered before. These unpredictable seasons affected the growth of plants. Trees that once relied on a cycle of warmth and rain found their leaves budding too early or too late. When the rains came unexpectedly, the young leaves struggled to absorb enough water. When the heat came too soon, the plants dried before they could grow tall. The timing of life itself began to shift. Animals that followed the seasons for migration or breeding found themselves out of sync with their environment. The signals they once relied upon were fading or arriving at the wrong moment. Temperature swings became more extreme. The warming air that had begun to settle across the land now carried greater differences from one season to the next. Some areas experienced sudden spikes of heat that pushed the limits of what plants and animals could endure. In other regions, cold weather lingered longer than expected, freezing plants that had just begun to grow. The delicate balance that had shaped the world for millions of years was slipping. These temperature shifts were not just happening in one region, they were spread across the planet. The interior of the great continent felt the heat first. Far from the sea, the land could no longer draw on the cool breeze or the moisture that once moderated the climate. The heart of the continent grew hotter, and the swings between heat and cold became sharper. The weather patterns that once brought rain became unpredictable. Regions that had known fertile soil and abundant plant life began to dry. Rainfall failed in places that had always depended on it. Ancient forests that had stood for countless generations could no longer rely on the steady rhythm of rain. The soil hardened, rivers shrank or disappeared. Plants that once formed thick canopies began to suffer. Their roots could no longer reach the water they needed. Even the species that were well adapted to drought found themselves struggling to survive. The places where life had once flourished became fragile. In other regions, the changes were more erratic. Storms formed suddenly and brought torrents of rain only to vanish just as quickly. The land could not absorb the water fast enough. Flash floods washed away soil and plants. Then the water would disappear again, leaving the earth dry and cracked. The reliable patterns that had shaped life were breaking apart. The land was beginning to feel the strain. Wherever these changes occurred, the ecosystems responded. Animals migrated to new regions in search of stability. Plants that had once grown in vast forests became fewer in number. The rivers that had supported so much life experienced shifts in their depths and courses. Creatures that followed these waterways found the old paths disrupted. Even the insects that played vital roles in pollination and decomposition faced difficulty as their environments changed. The early cracking of Earth's ecological foundation became visible in the smallest details. Soil that had once held together in a thick, rich layer began to break apart. Some species of plants adapted by growing smaller or spreading in new ways. Others disappeared entirely from the regions where they had once been abundant. The balance between life and environment grew more delicate. Each change in temperature or rainfall placed new pressures on the systems that supported life. The instability of the planet spread. Slowly but steadily, it reached into the oceans, where currents warmed, and into the mountains, where snow melted sooner than before. It touched the forests and plains, the rivers and the deserts. These changes were not uniform. They did not happen everywhere at once. Some regions continued to flourish for a time. Others fell into decline, but together they formed a pattern that scientists today can trace through the fossil record and the geology of the Earth. The planet had entered a time of uncertainty. The cycles that had once been reliable no longer held their shape. The seasons shifted. Temperatures swung between extremes. Rainfall came and went without warning. The world was growing less stable. The foundation that had supported life for so long was beginning to crack. Yet, even in this period of change, life continued. The creatures of the land and sea endured these transformations in their own ways. They adapted and migrated. They found new paths and new forms of survival. The earth was moving into a different kind of future, and every living being existed within that movement. Across the heart of the ancient supercontinent, the world's dryness took on a new shape. It did not remain confined to isolated valleys or the edges of weakening forests. It spread in wide, unbroken waves. The land that had once held ancient woodlands and river systems now transformed into vast deserts that stretched farther than any in our modern world. These were the megadeserts of Pangea, landscapes shaped by heat, wind, and the quiet push of geological forces. The reason for their expansion was written into the structure of the supercontinent itself. When the land masses of the Earth fused together into one, they created a world where the oceans lay far beyond the interior. The moisture that once traveled deep inland from the coasts could no longer reach the central regions. Without the steady presence of ocean air and rainfall, the land dried slowly under the ancient sun. The processation atmosphere above the interior of Pangea grew hotter. The clouds formed less often. When rain did fall, it was rare and brief. As the climate shifted, the ground began to change. Soil that had once been held together by the roots of plants started to loosen. Without enough water to bind it, the tandating earth broke apart into sand and dust. The winds moved freely across the open land, shaping the loose earth into ridges and dunes. These dunes were not small. Some grew as high as small mountains. They stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Fossil evidence shows their patterns preserved in stone, the sweeping shapes left behind after the sand was buried by time and compressed into rock. These fossil dunes are vast reminders of the ancient climate. They are found across regions that today are separated by oceans and continents, a sign of how widespread the deserts were. Their ridges reveal the direction of the wind that once sculpted them. The angles and curves show how the sand moved as the air swept across the hot land. The dunes held the shape of the wind like frozen waves, capturing the memory of a world that had grown dry and inhospitable. The heat of the megadeserts had another day, powerful impact on life. The temperature rose higher than in surrounding regions. The lack of moisture made the air feel sharp and unforgiving. Animals that had once moved freely across the land now found themselves limited by the harshness of the desert. The open ground offered little shelter. The sun beat down throughout the day, and the ground retained its warmth long into the night. These deserts did not form a single continuous stretch. Instead, they spread in wide belts across the middle of the supercontinent. Mountains and valleys created pockets of slightly more stable land, but the deserts slowly expanded into these areas as well. The heat and dryness crept outward, pushing the boundaries of life into smaller and smaller spaces. The patterns of the dunes show how the wind carved channels and corridors through the desert, shaping the paths that animals and plants could use. In some places, the dunes formed long chains that ran parallel to ancient riverbeds. The rivers that remained still offered some life, but the deserts were so vast that even these water sources could be buried under sand during severe droughts. Animals that relied on the rivers were forced to move along the edges of the desert or across the sand in search of new shelter. Their footprints were lost quickly to the wind. The heat trapped species into smaller habitats. Those that had once traveled freely across forests, plains, and river valleys now faced a shrinking world. The desert became a barrier that cut off migrations. The plants that had once grown in wide belts now survived only in isolated patches. These small refuges held the last remnants of life in regions that were becoming inhospitable. The megadeserts changed the movement of air across the continent. Hot air rose from the Prison desert surface, pulling cooler air from the surrounding areas. This created strong winds that swept dust and sand across the land. The wind shaped the dunes into new formations and carried dust into distant regions. Fossil layers reveal the presence of fine sand in areas far from the original deserts, a sign of how the wind spread the desert's influence across the continent. Even the colors of the desert told a story. The sand carried traces of minerals that reflected the ancient environment. Some dunes were rich in iron, giving them a reddish hue under the sun. Others were pale, shaped from the weathering of old rocks. These differences show how varied the desert was, even in its harshness. The landscape had its own patterns and complexities, shaped by the forces that built it. Life that adapted to the desert did so with remarkable resilience. Some plants grew deep roots to reach underground water. Some animals buried themselves in the sand during the hottest parts of the day. But even these adaptations could not protect them forever. The heat continued to rise. The deserts expanded farther than before. The land became more fragmented, and the habitats that once supported rich ecosystems became smaller and more isolated. The megadeserts of Pangea were not just empty spaces. They were the result of a long sequence of changes that began when the continents moved together. They were shaped by the climate that had grown less stable. They held the story of a world that was slowly losing its balance. These deserts formed the backdrop for another chapter in the ancient Earth, a world where heat and wind carried the memory of a planet drifting into an uncertain future. Along the broad margins of the ancient continents, where land and ocean met in a shifting ribbon of sand and stone, life continued to hold on. The shallow seas were the last strongholds of stability in a world that was growing less predictable each passing age. These coastal waters stretched for great distances and wrapped around Pangea like a living boundary, breathing in the planet's changes, yet enduring them more gently than the deeper ocean or the drying land. There were many reasons why the shallow seas survived longer than other places. The water here was warmed by sunlight, mixed more easily by waves and tides. The stirring of the currents carried oxygen from the surface into the water, keeping the organisms that lived there supplied with what they needed. The seafloor was close enough to the surface that plants and algae could use the sunlight to grow. These simple organisms, anchored on rocks or drifting in the water, supported entire chains of life above them. The shallow seas created a kind of shelter for countless species. They were less vulnerable to the stagnation that gripped the deeper parts of the ocean. New water moved in with every tide. Rivers still brought nutrients from the land. The warmth and light supported corals and sponges that built complex underwater structures. Fish and invertebrates lived among these reefs, feeding on the plants and small animals that flourished in the coastal environment. Even as the oceans beyond began to lose their oxygen and change in ways that could not support large creatures, the shallows continued to host a variety of life. It was here that shell-building organisms still clung to the ancient reefs. These creatures formed their shells from minerals drawn from the surrounding water. They built strong external skeletons made of calcium-rich compounds, shaping the habitats that sheltered many species. But as conditions in the ocean shifted, these shell builders began to struggle. The water started to change in a subtle but powerful way. As carbon content rose in the atmosphere, more of it dissolved into the sea. This created a chemical that slowly turned the water more acidic. It did not become dangerous quickly. The change was slow, almost gentle, but for the creatures that built shells and reefs, it was a growing threat. When the water becomes more acidic, it interferes with the minerals that shell-building organisms need. Their shells form more slowly, or not at all. The material that once hardened into protective walls became weaker. In the fossil record, scientists can see these changes in the shells left behind. Some are thinner than normal, others are incomplete. In some places, the reefs show signs of erosion where the acidity dissolved the structures that had once been strong. The struggle of these creatures reveals how connected the shallow seas were to everything happening across the planet. The ancient shell builders were the architects of thriving ecosystems. Their colonies offered shelter for fish and invertebrates. Their presence supported food chains that reached into the open ocean. When their ability to build was threatened, the entire coastal environment shifted with them. Despite these challenges, the shallow seas became the last places on Earth where biodiversity was still rich. It is here that scientists find evidence of surprising complexity just before the world tipped fully into collapse. Fossils from these regions show dozens of species living together in one patch of reef. Sponges, early corals, mollusks, and small, swimming fish moved among these habitats. Plants and algae grew in thick mats across the seafloor. The water still carried enough oxygen to support life. The sunlight still reached the bottom, carrying warmth and energy. This diversity reveals how tenacious life can be. Even as the land dried and the deeper waters formed dead zones, The shallow seas remained full of movement. Schools of fish traveled along the reefs. Small predators hunted among the rocks. Shell-building organisms continued to grow even as the water slowly turned against them. The reefs acted as sanctuaries, holding pockets of life in balance long after other environments began to fail. These regions offer a final glimpse of what the world once was. The shallow seas were places of color and texture. The plants and animals formed patterns and shapes that filled the water with life. Scientists know this not only from the fossils of shells and bones, but from the sediments that hold the impressions of ancient reefs and the remains of countless organisms. For a time, the shallow seas resisted the forces that were changing the earth. They held on to their diversity. They sheltered species that had nowhere else to go. The waves continued to wash over the reefs, stirring the water and bringing fresh oxygen. The sun continued to warm the surface. The shallow seas remained alive even as the rest of the world struggled. The story of these coastal ecosystems shows how the last pieces of stability remained. In the most delicate spaces, life gathered there in dense and complex communities. It was the final refuge of a world that once carried a balance between land and sea, light and darkness, heat and coolness. Even as the ocean beyond grew darker, the shallows held on to their ancient rhythm, one tide at a time. As deserts widened and shallow seas became crowded refuges, the world still carried pockets of life that held on against the growing instability. These places were not large. They were scattered across the continents like islands of calm in a changing world. They existed where geography and climate worked together to soften the pressures of heat and drought. They were the last strongholds of diversity, places where ancient ecosystems resisted collapse for a little longer. Some of these regions were valleys tucked between mountains. The high stone walls offered shelter from the harshest winds and the burning sun. Snow and ice that collected at the peaks melted into small streams that flowed down into the valley floor. These streams provided water when the rest of the land was drying. The soil in these sheltered places held moisture longer than the open plains. Plants could root deeply and spread their leaves to the sun. Forests grew in narrow bands along the riverbanks. Ferns, conifers, and low shrubs created layers of green that provided shade for smaller creatures. Within these valleys, animals found the resources they needed to survive. Herbivores grazed on the plants that grew along the water's edge. They drank from the streams and rested in the shade when the sun grew strong. Predators followed them into these sheltered areas, hunting along the edges where the forest met the open land. The presence of water allowed life to continue even as the rest of the planet was growing less stable. River deltas formed another sanctuary. These places existed where the rivers met the sea, spreading silt and minerals across wide plains. The mixing of fresh and salt water created rich environments where plants grew quickly and in abundance. These deltas changed constantly. As the rivers shifted their paths, their branching channels carried nutrients that nurtured the land. Marshes formed along the shallow edges, creating habitats for insects, amphibians, and early reptiles. The coolness of these areas made them resistant to the warming climate for longer than surrounding regions. The movement of water and the mixing of air created a balance that protected life. Plants along the deltas grew thick and strong. Their roots held the soil in place, preventing the land from drying as quickly. Animals found shelter among the vegetation. They built nests and burrows in places where the ground was soft and moist. Coastal pockets along the edges of the supercontinent were also important refuges. These areas benefited from the influence of the ocean. Winds carried moisture inland. The air was cooler than in the interior. Even when the climate shifted, these coastal regions changed more slowly. The plants that grew there had access to steady rainfall or gentle mist from the sea. The soil remained fertile. The trees formed canopies that shielded the ground from direct sunlight. The animals that lived in these coastal pockets adapted to their close-pros environments in remarkable ways. Some moved between land and water, feeding on plants or fish. Others traveled along the coastline in search of new shelter. The presence of water created opportunities for life to flourish. These coastal areas became places of shelter not just for individual species, but for entire ecosystems. The resilience of these strongholds reveals something important about life on Earth. When the world changes, life does not disappear all at once. It retreats into places where the environment offers protection. It adapts to the new conditions and continues to move forward. The valleys, river deltas, and coastal pockets acted as centers of stability in a time of instability. They held the memory of the ancient world and preserved its diversity for a little longer. These ecosystems resisted collapse not because they were untouched by the changes, but because they were shaped by geography that offered moments of shelter. The rivers provided water when rain was scarce, the forests offered shade, the sea cooled the air, the land and water formed patterns that supported life even as the rest of the world became more difficult to survive. Scientists, studying the rocks and fossils of these regions, can see the signs of resilience. They find traces of species that vanished from other areas long before they disappeared from these strongholds. They see evidence of ecosystems that continued to function despite the pressures of drought and heat. These fossils hold the remains of plants and animals that sheltered in these pockets of stability. The presence of these strongholds shows how life can adapt and endure. Even when the climate shifted and the oceans changed, life found ways to continue. The diversity of species in these places remained high for longer than in the rest of the world. This resilience allowed life to survive and evolve as the planet moved into the next phase of its history. The story of the last strongholds of diversity is one of persistence. It is a story of how life can gather in small pockets and maintain its balance even when the larger world becomes unstable. These places remind us that life is both fragile and enduring. It can be pushed into corners by the forces of nature, yet it continues to grow and adapt. The valleys, deltas, and coastal shelters carried the ancient world forward, one tide and one season at a time. As the world continued to change, the silence that first crept across the forests began to deepen. The trees that once covered vast areas of land were entering their own era of struggle. These ancient forests had stood for millions of years. Their roots reached deep into the soil. Their leaves held the memory of stable climates and shifting seasons. Yet they were now facing conditions that pressed against the limits of their endurance. The first signs of crisis appeared in the forests closest to the edges of the growing deserts. The trees that lined riverbanks and valleys had already begun to feel the strain of unpredictable rainfall and rising temperatures. Further from these last refuges, the land changed more quickly. Forest cover shrank as drought and heat dried the soil. The leaves of the trees began to wither earlier in the year. The canopy thinned, branches that once reached toward the sky now cracked under the stress of changing climate. The loss of forest cover was not a sudden collapse. It moved slowly across the land. Forests that had stood for generations became smaller. Their boundaries retreated as the soil dried and rivers dwindled. These forests had created habitats for countless species. They had shaped the flow of water, stabilized the soil, and sheltered life beneath their branches. Now, as they weakened, the land grew more vulnerable. The trees faced another challenge as the world warmed: photosynthesis, the process that had once turned sunlight into energy. began to falter. Photosynthesis creates oxygen and supports the growth of plants. It is the heartbeat of the Earth's ecosystems. Yet, as the temperature increased and humidity dropped, plants began to struggle to take in the carbon they needed. Their leaves closed to conserve water. Their growth slowed. In some regions, forests that had once been dense and vibrant now formed open spaces. The space between the trees widened. Light reached the forest floor, drying the soil. The plants beneath the canopy, once protected by shade, now faced direct exposure to the sun. Their leaves curled. Their bodies became smaller and more fragile. The strength of the forest was draining away. Declining photosynthesis had another consequence. The amount of oxygen released into the atmosphere began to fall. Plants play a central role in maintaining the balance of oxygen and carbon. They absorb carbon and release oxygen into the air. As their ability to photosynthesize weakened, the atmosphere began to change. This change was slow at first, but it marked the beginning of a new shift in the planet's balance. The world that had once depended on trees for oxygen and stability was losing one of its most important anchors. Even the trees in the strongest regions began to show signs of stress. Their growth rings, preserved in the fossil record, reveal the story of these changes. Trees that once grew evenly year by year now show narrow rings, a sign of limited resources. The wood tells of seasons where sunlight and water were not enough. These changes spread across different regions, revealing how the forest struggled in a world where climate and water were no longer reliable. Fossil pollen provides another record of the transformation. Pollen grains are small and light. They carried the memory of ancient forests into the sediment that settled over time. Scientists who study these layers find changes in the types of pollen present. In earlier layers, the diversity of pollen reflects a rich mix of tree species. As the crisis deepened, the variety decreased. Some types of pollen vanished altogether. Other types became more common, indicating changes in the dominant trees. This shifting pollen record reveals dramatic turnovers in the forest ecosystems. In places where forests had once been dominated by a single species, new trees began to grow. These species were often more resilient and could survive in drier conditions, but their presence showed how the environment was changing. The trees that had once been the foundation of the forest were disappearing. New species took their place, forming ecosystems that looked different from those that came before. As the forests changed, the animals that depended on them adapted or moved on. Herbivores that grazed on leaves found fewer sources of food. Predators faced the same pressure. The entire web of life shifted as the plants at the base of the food chain declined. Some animals traveled to new regions where forests still offered shelter. Others changed their diets or habits. Some species vanished, leaving gaps in the ecosystem that could not be filled. The crisis facing the forests was part of the larger changes occurring across the world. The land was growing drier. The oceans were changing. The atmosphere itself was shifting. Together, these forces created a world where the forests could no longer thrive as they once had. Their decline marked the weakening of one of the Earth's most fundamental systems. The story of plants in crisis is not only a story of decline, it is also a story of adaptation and survival. Even as some species vanished, others found ways to endure. New trees grew in the spaces left behind. Plants developed deeper roots or smaller leaves. The natural world responded to the conditions of a changing planet. These transformations reveal how interconnected the world was. When the climate shifted, the forests changed. When the forests changed, the atmosphere shifted. The crisis among the plants was a sign that the balance of life was changing. It was a quiet reminder that even the most ancient and steady ecosystems could feel the weight of a world growing difficult to sustain. Across the land and in the waters that circled the ancient supercontinent, the changes that began with shifting climates and weakening forests spread into the most delicate and interconnected part of life itself. The food webs that once flowed with abundance started to contract. These webs were networks that linked every creature to another. They stretched from the smallest plants and plankton to the largest predators. But even the strongest connections began to dissolve when the world could no longer offer the resources they needed. The first signs of a shrinking food web appeared in the subtle imbalance between predator and prey. In the earlier ages of the Permian, predators had thrived alongside grazing animals and insects. Plants had supported herbivores. Herbivores had supported carnivores. It was a system that had taken millions of years to build. Yet the moment the plants began to withdraw, the balance started to tilt. Predators rely on prey that grow in steady numbers. When the herds grew smaller and more scattered, the predators faced increased difficulty. They had to travel greater distances to hunt. Some species adapted by becoming more opportunistic. They shifted their diets or changed their hunting patterns. But others were closely tied to specific prey. When those prey disappeared from a region or died off entirely, the predators lost their main source of food. The imbalance grew more pronounced. Fewer herbivores meant fewer predators. The predators that remained competed fiercely for territory and prey. In the fossil record, scientists find signs of starvation and reduced size in certain species. Their bones hold the story of a world where food was becoming scarce. Even the strongest predators struggled to maintain their bodies in a landscape that no longer supported them. This strain on the land-based food webs was mirrored in the oceans. Marine ecosystems had once been filled with intricate relationships between producers and consumers. The smallest organisms formed the foundation. Tiny plankton, algae, and microbial life created the base of the marine food chains. They multiplied in sunlight and sustained the herbivores of the sea. Those herbivores in turn supported larger predators, creating a web of life that extended across the ocean. But as the oceans warmed and oxygen levels shifted, these small organisms began to struggle. The plankton that depended on stable temperatures and nutrient-rich waters could not adapt quickly to the changing conditions. Some regions saw a decline in their numbers. The tiny creatures that once existed in vast swarms became fewer. Nutrient shortages followed. Nutrients in the water come from the movement of currents and the mixing of layers. As the ocean circulation slowed, the nutrients settled in lower layers of water or were consumed faster than they were replenished. The food chains in the ocean began to shrink from their foundation. Without plankton, herbivorous animals that grazed in the shallows struggled to find enough food. The collapse moved upward through the food web. One of the most significant aspects of this collapse was that it happened from the bottom up. The creatures at the base of the food web disappeared long before the larger species showed signs of distress. The loss of plankton and algae meant that the animals that depended on them faced starvation. The predators that hunted those animals then faced the same scarcity. The collapse of the marine food webs shows how closely intertwined the ocean environments were. When the smallest organisms began to vanish, the whole system faltered. The reefs lost their ability to sustain life. Fish and invertebrates that once lived among the coral and rock faced increasing challenges. The predators that once roamed the open water found fewer areas to feed. In some regions, larger marine predators continued to survive, but their domain was shrinking. Their hunting grounds became isolated pockets. They were no longer able to roam freely across the seas. Fossils found in ancient seabeds reveal patterns of migration and concentration. The predators gathered where the cavern, last remnants of food remained. The decline of the food webs also affected the land. Insects and small animals that relied on plants or smaller prey faced their own crisis. As the forests thinned and the grasslands dried, the insects had fewer places to feed and shelter. Animals that hunted insects found the same challenges. The food chains that had been so abundant began to unravel. Some species were remarkably resilient. They adapted to new food sources or changed their behaviors. They migrated to new regions or evolved to survive on less. These responses show the flexibility and persistence of life. But these adaptations could only slow the collapse. They could not stop it. The shrinking food webs reveal how life depends on a delicate balance between species and their environments. When the foundation is shaken, the entire network begins to shift. The ancient world was feeling the weight of interconnected changes. From the land to the sea, the pressure of a destabilizing planet spread into every corner of life. The story of the shrinking food webs is a quiet reminder of the importance of the smallest organisms. It shows how the forces that shape the world do not always begin with the strongest or the most visible. They often begin with the creatures that are hidden from sight. They begin with the gradual shifts that ripple through ecosystems until every part feels the change. In the late Permian world, these shifts marked a new turning point in the delicate architecture of life. The world that once moved through gentle cycles of warmth and coolness now shifted with a different rhythm. Each year brought new surprises. The planet that had held a familiar balance for millions of years began to swing between extremes. This growing instability did not come as a single moment or event. It unfolded like a gradual shaking of the Earth's breath, spreading across continents, oceans, and sky. One of the most striking changes was the rise in temperature swings. The air no longer behaved as it once had. Some regions saw long stretches of heat that pushed the limits of what plants and animals could survive. Other times, sudden drops in temperature brought cold that lingered in places that had not known frost for countless generations. These shifts happened across seasons and years. They were not predictable. They twisted the climate into unfamiliar shapes. These temperature swings meant that life could no longer rely on steady conditions. Plants that depended on the warmth of spring to bud and bloom found themselves exposed to sudden cold. Their new leaves froze before they could grow. Animals that depended on seasonal warmth to migrate or reproduce faced new challenges. Their instincts no longer matched the altered rhythm of the land. The patterns that once guided life became unreliable. As the temperature instability grew, another important pattern began to break. The monsoons, which had brought rain and life to large regions of the Provet supercontinent, started to falter. Monsoons form when warm air rises and pulls moisture inland from the sea. They create storms that bring water to forests, plains, and valleys. These storms were vital for the survival of many ecosystems, but as the climate changed, the monsoon patterns grew weaker. In some years, the monsoons came late. The land dried long before the rain arrived. Forests and fields waited for water that did not fall. Rivers and streams shrank. The soil cracked under the sun. When the monsoons finally came, the rain was often too little or too quick. In other years, the monsoons arrived with sudden force. Storms carried heavy rain and strong winds. They swept across the land and caused floods. The land could not absorb the water fast enough. The soil washed away. It became difficult for plants to root and grow. These broken monsoons were more than changes in weather. They reflected a deeper instability in the climate system. The balance between land and sea, heat and moisture, was shifting. The familiar cycles of rain and drought had begun to fall apart. This instability spread across the supercontinent. Regions that had always relied on monsoon rains found themselves struggling to survive. Beyond the land, the sky became another carrier of change. Dust and ash drifted across continents. The deserts, which had grown larger and more widespread, released vast amounts of dust into the air. Windstorms lifted this dust high into the sky and carried it across the land. The air became hazy in some regions. Fine particles settled on leaves and blocked sunlight. Water in the rivers and lakes carried traces of dust. These dust storms added another layer of challenge for life. Plants struggled to absorb sun through dust-covered leaves. Animals struggled to breathe in regions where the air was thick with particles. The dust settled on the surface of the sea and changed the color of the water. It carried minerals and soil far from the places where they once rested. Ash became another traveler across the sky. Volcanoes in distant regions erupted more frequently. They released ash and gases that drifted through the air currents. These eruptions did not always cause immediate destruction, but their influence stretched across great distances. Ash settled on the land and changed the chemistry of the soil. It cooled the air in some places and warmed it in others. These airborne particles carried the signatures of distant regions and altered the climate in subtle but powerful ways. The movement of dust and ash across continents shows how interconnected the world was becoming. A storm in one region could change the conditions. In another, a volcano in a distant land could place a thin blanket of ash across a forest or river far away. The atmosphere became a carrier of change, holding the traces of shifting land and sea. These changes in temperature, monsoons, dust, and ash reveal the growing volatility of the climate. The world no longer moved through gentle transitions. It swung between hot and cold, dry and wet. The patterns that had once defined the Earth's climate became unpredictable. Life had to respond to conditions that shifted with greater force and frequency. Plants and animals adapted where they could. Some species migrated. Others changed their habits. Still others vanished quietly, leaving gaps in the food webs. The ecosystems that survived were those that could endure the instability. They found ways to continue in a world that was no longer steady. The rise of climate volatility was a sign of deeper changes. The atmosphere was shifting. The land and oceans were responding. The Earth was entering a new phase, one shaped by unpredictability and movement. These changes set the stage for events that would carry the planet even further from the balance it once knew. For so long, the rivers had been the lifelines of the ancient world. They captured snowmelt from distant mountains and gathered the slow trickle of streams that once wound their way through forests and valleys. They moved across the land with a steady confidence, carving their paths deeper with every season. Even as the forests began to shrink, even as the climate shifted, the rivers flowed on. But now, the world was asking too much of them. Their strength began to waver. In earlier ages, the rivers had flooded their banks and created wide floodplains. These floodplains were rich with life. Sediment washed over the land and brought nutrients that allowed plants to flourish. Animals gathered near the river's edge. This cycle of flood and retreat created landscapes filled with grasses and trees. But as drought grew more common, the floodplains began to dry. Water that once spread across the land during the rainy season no longer reached the same distances. The soil hardened under the sun. Cracks formed in the ground. The grasses that grew along the riverbanks became brittle and sparse. The river no longer had enough strength to push its way through the dry land. The floodplains that had once been fertile became stretches of dry earth. As the rivers dried, their paths began to change. Great channels that had run in the same direction for thousands of years shifted. The riverbeds became shallow. In some places, the water no longer flowed freely. It pooled and stagnated, forming still lakes and ponds that held water for only a short time. In other places, the rivers split into smaller streams that wandered across the landscape in search of new paths. These changing river paths created new challenges for the animals that depended on the rivers. Fish that had once swum in deep water now found themselves trapped in shrinking pools. Amphibians struggled to reach new water sources. Their movements were blocked by dry stretches of land. Some were able to burrow into the mud and wait for the return of rain. Others were stranded and could not survive the round-tom heat. Even the larger animals that lived along the rivers felt the strain. Herbivores that had once grazed on the plants that grew along the riverbanks faced a lack of food. Their herds became smaller as water became scarce. Predators followed them along the dry paths of the rivers. The rivers had become the last paths to survival. As the world grew warmer and drier, the rivers changed in ways that left lasting marks on the land. Fossils from this time reveal how animals adapted to the failing rivers. Paleontologists find the remains of creatures clustered near the last water sources. These fossils show how animals gathered in the shrinking pools and near the river mouths. They reveal how the herds moved from place to place as the rivers continued to change. In some regions, the fossil record shows layers of sediment where multiple species gathered. Bones of herbivores and carnivores lie side by side. Their remains tell the story of competition and desperation. The rivers that had once been places of safety and abundance had become the last refuge. The presence of fossils in these places reveals patterns of movement and struggle. The creatures that came to the rivers tried to hold on to life as long as they could. The changing paths of the rivers also influenced the movement of the land. As riverbeds dried, the soil around them broke apart. Wind carried dust and sand into new regions. The shifting of the rivers caused the land to lose stability. Without the flow of water, the soil hardened and eroded. These changes impacted the surrounding ecosystems. Plants that had once grown in moist soil faced new challenges. Their roots could not reach the deeper layers of water. The rivers did not disappear all at once. Some sections continued to flow while others dried. The riverbeds shifted and bent, creating new directions for the water to travel. Animals followed these new paths. They searched for places where the water still moved. They drank from the last pools and stayed near the shrinking streams. The failure of the rivers was a gradual process. It began with small changes in the flow and ended with rivers that could no longer sustain the life around them. The world that had once been stable and predictable now faced uncertainty. The rivers, which had been the center of life for millions of years, reflected the larger changes taking place across the earth. In the shallow pools and drying riverbeds, the fossils of animals reveal how life responded to these shifts. They show the movement of species toward the last water sources. They capture the moment when the rivers became the final shelter before the land could no longer support them. The story of the failing rivers is a gentle reminder of the deep connections between water and life. It shows how the earth changed in ways that touched every part of the planet. As the rivers began to fail, the world entered a new phase of transformation. The water that had sustained so much, life now moved in unpredictable ways, carving new paths across the land one quiet moment at a time. As rivers shifted and forests thinned, the changes rippling across the world began to move from quiet transformations to visible migrations. For countless generations, many species had lived within familiar territories. They had grazed upon the same plains, hunted along the same valleys, and nested in regions that carried their ancestral memories. But now, the stability that had shaped their lives was slipping away. The land no longer offered the same security. Moisture became scarce. Temperatures climbed. Food grew harder to find. The ancient balance had tipped. The animals felt these changes as strongly as the land and air did. When the first water sources dried, herds that once stayed close to rivers began to move. They followed the last remaining streams or sought new ones that had not yet failed. These migrations were not quick or organized. They were slow movements, driven by necessity rather than instinct. The animals were searching for safety in a world that was becoming more hostile. Species that had once been separated by distance or terrain now began to move closer together. Fossil evidence shows the remains of creatures that do not usually appear in the same regions. Their presence together reveals how the drying land forced them into contact. Predators that once hunted in one region migrated alongside herbivores that had always lived far away. Their footprints intersected in the fossil beds. Their bones lie side by side, showing a world where the lines between territories blurred. In the plains that bordered the megadeserts, herds of large herbivores moved across the land. They traveled in search of new grasslands or areas where plants still grew. Their hooves pressed into the dry soil, leaving behind trails that paleontologists can still read in the sediment. These movements were not unusual for individual animals, but the scale of the migrations was greater than before. Entire populations were shifting. Predators followed. They rarely had the luxury of staying in one place. As prey became less reliable, predators adapted by traveling greater distances. Their fossils show changes in body size or shape that suggest the pressures of a more competitive environment. Some species became leaner. Their bones reveal the story of animals that had to move more often and expend greater energy to find food. They played a different role in the changing world. They were not just hunters, they became travelers along ancient migration paths. These migration events did not just involve the larger species. Small animals also moved, sometimes in greater numbers than before. Insects and amphibians found new habitats in cooler regions or areas where rivers still flowed. Their presence in strange combinations reveals the impact of the changing climate. Fossils show the remains of creatures that lived on land alongside those that lived in water. Their coexistence tells a story of how habitats shifted and became more intertwined. Over time, these migrations created unusual overlaps between species that had not shared space before. Predators encountered new prey. Herbivores found themselves competing for limited resources. The once clear boundaries between ecosystems faded. The food webs shifted as species interacted in new ways. This created new challenges for survival as competition increased. Competition became one of the defining forces across the land. As habitats shrank, animals fought for access to food, water, and shelter. Predators were not only hunting for food, they were competing against other predators. Herbivores faced scarcity of vegetation. The shrinking of habitable land meant that species that once coexisted peacefully now struggled to find enough resources to survive. The fossil record shows signs of this competition. Bones reveal stress fractures or injuries that suggest conflict. Predator marks appear on the remains of animals that were not previously their prey. The interactions between species grew more complex and more desperate. The world was forcing them into situations that had not been part of their evolutionary history. For many species, these migrations represented a last attempt to escape the pressures of a weakening environment. They sought water wherever it could be found. They moved toward the last pockets of shade and vegetation. But the shriveling of riverbeds and the spreading of deserts limited their options. Some species adapted by changing their diets or behaviors. They learned to forage in new ways or burrow into the ground to escape the heat. The land itself bore the marks of these migrations, trails carved into the soil by moving herds, footprints that crossed paths with others, fossils of animals resting near the banks of the last water sources. These marks reveal how the land was reshaped by the movement of life. The migrations became part of the Earth's geological story. The traces of these journeys remain written in the rocks, capturing the moment when species responded to the pressures of a changing world. The movement of species across the land was not a single event. It was a series of shifts that took place over thousands of years. The changes in the land, the struggles for survival, and the encounters between species reveal how life adapted to the growing instability. These migrations show the resilience of life in the face of change. They also reveal how fragile the balance had become. The story of migration in the late Permian world is not only a story of movement, it is a story of adaptation and competition. It reflects how the Earth's ecosystems were beginning to unravel. Yet, it also shows how life continued to move and transform. The animals that crossed the land carried with them the memory of the ancient world, seeking new places to survive in a landscape that was shifting beneath their feet. Far from the dusty interior of Pangea, beneath the still surface of distant seas, another story was unfolding. The changes that reshaped the land had begun to seep into the oceans. The water was warming. The air above it carried new substances. The ancient balance of minerals and gas that had supported life for ages was beginning to falter. The change came quietly at first, carried by currents that were once dependable, but over time, the signs of strain became clearer. One of the most fragile parts of the marine world was the balance of carbonates. For millions of years, oceans had held dissolved minerals that were essential for the creatures that built shells, reefs, and skeletons. These minerals allowed life to grow upward from the seafloor, creating homes that supported countless other species. But the warming of the atmosphere and the shifting chemistry of the water began to reduce those carbonates. The oceans became more acidic. Shell builders found it harder to grow. Their bodies showed thinning walls and irregular shapes. Ancient reefs that had stretched across shallow waters began to weaken. They crumbled under the pressure of the changing water. What had once been strong frameworks of life turned fragile. The decline in carbonate levels was not a small shift. It was the slow loss of one of the most fundamental building blocks of marine ecosystems. Paleontologists can see this change in sediments that hold the remains of ancient shells. The fossils show deformities. They show incomplete growth. They show the story of minerals slipping from the water. As the chemistry shifted, it created new dangers in the deep. Layers of water that had always held steady amounts of oxygen began to change. The deeper ocean had always held darker, colder waters, where life was less common. But now these layers were growing more dangerous. They held less oxygen. The boundary between healthy water and low oxygen water began to rise. This created what scientists would later call toxic zones. They formed where the water no longer supported life. These zones were not just empty. They held new forms of bacteria that thrived in the oxygen-poor water. These bacteria released substances that spread upward. One of the most dangerous was hydrogen sulfide. It is a chemical that can poison animals that breathe it or absorb it through their skin. It drifted upward from the deep, carried by currents that once brought nutrients. The oceans were changing in ways that were invisible to the creatures at the surface, but those changes were becoming more deadly. Fish that once swam in open water began to disappear in some regions. Their fossils show sudden gaps. In places where entire populations had once thrived, the seafloor reveals almost no remains. This is one of the most striking signals that paleontologists find in the rocks. The sudden disappearance of species. The gaps in the fossil record are not simply places where fossils were never preserved. They are records of rapid die-offs. These die-offs are visible in layers of sediment that settle on the seafloor. Each layer holds the remains of what lived and died in those waters. In some layers, there are abundant fossils, showing a thriving ecosystem. But in the layers above them, there are far fewer remains. Fish and shell builders vanish from the record. The sediments become fine and dark. They show the moment when life could no longer survive. These patterns appear in multiple parts of the world. They show that the changes in the ocean were not isolated or local. They were happening across vast distances. The same signals appear on opposite sides of the ancient world. It reveals a global shift. The oceans were approaching a point where they could no longer support the vast webs of life that had evolved over millions of years. The expansion of toxic zones pushed marine life toward the surface. Animals that once lived in deeper waters moved into shallower regions. They clustered in coastal areas where oxygen remained. These coastal refuges became crowded. Competition increased. The water became warmer near the shore. Even these last strongholds began to face stress. Some species adapted to the changing water. They grew smaller. They lived shorter lives. They reproduced more quickly. These changes are visible in their fossils. But adaptation could not keep pace with the speed of the transformation. The warming water continued to rise. The oxygen poor layers continued to spread. The fossils tell the story of repeated die-offs. In one moment, the record shows thriving life. In the next, it shows silence. The seafloor captured the transition in fine particles of sediment. They settled gently over the remains of creatures that could not escape. The changing water. Layer by layer, the story unfolded. It is a quiet record, written in stone. The oceans had always been vast reservoirs of life. They held more diversity and abundance than any place on land, but now they were approaching a limit. The changes in chemistry and temperature were shifting the balance toward instability. The waters that had nurtured life for so long were beginning to turn against it. In the ancient layers of rock, we can see the moment when the oceans began to fail. The minerals changed, the currents shifted, the oxygen vanished. The once thriving marine world entered a new chapter. It happened slowly and quietly, as so many transformations in Earth's story do. The oceans were approaching a breaking point, one layer of sediment at a time. As the land dried and the seas darkened, there were still places where life held steady. Not all at once did the world fall into crisis. For a time, there were pockets of stability, small regions where the ancient balance had not yet broken. They became sanctuaries, protected by geography, climate, or chance. These last strongholds of life offered a glimpse of the world that once was. They also revealed the final stages of a changing planet. Some of these stable ecosystems were found near the coasts, where the ocean still brought moisture. Even though the seas were warming and chemical changes were spreading from the deep, the coastal regions remained cooler than the dry interior. They were shielded by winds and currents. Plants grew in the soil along the shoreline. Animals found food and shelter in the vegetation. These pockets of life became islands of survival. Others were found in valleys where water collected from mountain streams. The valleys were shaded and held onto moisture longer than the plains. Trees grew along the riverbanks. They created a canopy that protected smaller plants from the heat. These valleys supported herds of herbivores and the predators that followed. Paleo. Ecologists find evidence of these refuges in the fossil record. The presence of multiple species indicates that life was still thriving in these regions, even as other ecosystems struggled. In some regions, the land near the water remained fertile. These coastal and valley ecosystems served as meeting places for species migrating from other parts of the continent. Animals that had crossed the dry plains sought refuge in these last strongholds. They brought with them their own unique behaviors and adaptations. The interactions between species in these pockets reveal the complexity of the ancient world. Life continued here for longer than in other parts of Pangea. The plants grew deep roots to find water. Their leaves shifted in shape and size to capture moisture. The animals adapted by changing what they ate or how they moved. They learned to navigate the shifting boundaries of their environment. These adaptations kept the ecosystems functioning, even as the world around them changed. But these pockets were not immune to the shifts taking place across the planet. As the climate became more unpredictable, rainfall patterns changed. Regions that once received steady water began to dry. The rivers that fed the valleys grew weaker. The coasts faced rising temperatures. The protective barriers that had sheltered these ecosystems began to dissolve. When the rainfall decreased, the plants were the first to feel the strain. Their roots could no longer reach the water they needed. Their leaves dropped and their growth slowed. The canopy that had shaded the smaller plants became thinner. The shade no longer protected the soil. The ground dried and cracked. Without enough water, the ecosystems began to unravel. The animals that relied on these plants faced new challenges. Herbivores that had once grazed in the valleys now found food scarce. Predators hunted further and farther. The balance that had kept the ecosystem stable began to shift. Some species were able to adapt for a time. They changed their behaviors and moved to find new resources. But the spaces where they could survive became smaller. The eventual failure of these ecosystems was not sudden. It came from the gradual weakening of the natural systems that had supported life. The rivers that once fed the valleys dried. The winds that had cooled the coasts became warmer. The last pockets of life began to resemble the dry lands around them. The changes that had once seemed distant now reached into the last refuges. The fossil record reveals the final stages of these stable ecosystems. In the early layers, paleontologists find signs of diverse life. They find the remains of plants, animals, and microbes that thrived together. In the layers above, the fossils become sparse. The remains of fewer species are found. The sediment reflects the drying of the environment, the loss of water, and the change in soil conditions. The collapse of these last ended strongholds reveals something important about the planet. It shows how ecosystems can resist change for long periods. They hold on while others fail. They adapt. They shift. They absorb the pressures of the world. But even the strongest ecosystems reach a point where they cannot withstand the changes around them. They show how interconnected life is and how a shift in one part of the world can spread to others. These last stable ecosystems tell the story of resilience. They show how life continued even as the world changed. But they also reveal the limits of that resilience. The collapse of these pockets of stability marks a turning point. It shows the moment when the systems that had supported life for millions of years could no longer hold back the pressure of a changing world. The valleys dried, the coasts warmed, the forests thinned, the last strongholds of life gave way to a world that was no longer able to sustain the balance that had once made it rich. It was a gentle transition, written in the land and captured in the fossils. With their collapse, the Earth moved one step closer to the changes that would reshape the planet forever. Even as the last pockets of life held on to their fragile balance, the greatest changes of all were gathering far beneath the surface. Some of the earliest signals did not come from the forests or the rivers or the seas. They came from the deep places of the earth, from the ancient mantle where heat and pressure shaped stone and metal into currents of molten rock. For millions of years, these processes had moved slowly. They shifted continents across the planet and created mountains that rose toward the sky. But now the movement was becoming more intense. Beneath the northern reaches of Pangea, in a region that would one day be called Siberia, something powerful was stirring. Magma began to rise from the depths. It pushed upward through cracks and weaknesses in the crust. The pressure increased. The land above it swelled and shifted. This rising magma would become one of the most significant geological events in the history of life. At first, there was no great explosion. The change began quietly. Small eruptions occurred in places where magma reached the surface. Lava spread across the land. It cooled and hardened, forming new layers of rock, but the eruption did not stop. It continued to build. Over thousands of years, these eruptions grew larger. The flows of lava covered more land. They spread across valleys and plains. They changed the shape of the landscape. This region would later become known for the Siberian traps, vast stairsteps of hardened lava that stretch across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. But in the time we are exploring, this enormous volcanic province was only beginning to form. The eruptions released vast amounts of gas into the atmosphere. These gases changed the balance of the air. Volcanic gases include carbon dioxide. They also include sulfur compounds and other substances that can alter the climate. As the eruptions continued, more and more gas was released. The atmosphere began to shift. The warming of the planet accelerated. The balance of oxygen and carbon changed. Scientists can see the evidence of this shift in ancient rocks. The chemical signatures show that something dramatic was happening. In sediment layers from this time, the carbon isotopes change. The ratio of certain elements shifts in a way that reveals massive releases of volcanic gases. These shifts are found not only near the ancient volcanic fields but across the world. They show that the gases spread through the atmosphere. They reached every ecosystem. They touched every corner of the earth. The rise of volcanic activity also released other compounds into the atmosphere. Some of these substances reflected sunlight and cooled the land for short periods, but the long-term effects of the eruptions increased the heat. The combination of warming gases and chemical changes pushed the climate closer to instability. This balance between cooling and warming created unpredictable patterns that affected all life. The rising magma did more than change the air. It altered the land itself. The pressure from below created fractures in the crust. It opened new pathways for lava to flow. The volcanic activity continued to spread. The eruptions became larger. The flows of lava grew deeper. This region of the world became a landscape of fire. Volcanic rocks from this time reveal the scale of the event. They show layers of basalt that formed from repeated eruptions. These layers hold the story of the magma rising from the mantle. They also reveal the intensity of the heat that reshaped the land. The volcanic activity was not a single moment. It was a series of eruptions that occurred over hundreds of thousands of years. Together, they marked the beginning of one of the greatest mass extinctions in Earth's history. The gases from these eruptions did not remain close to the ground. They mixed with the atmosphere and traveled across the planet. They reached the oceans and changed their chemistry. They contributed to the collapse of carbonate levels. They altered the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide. They created a feedback loop that increased the stress on ecosystems. Scientists can trace these changes in the chemical signatures found in rocks and sediments. These signatures act as markers In the geological record, they show when the eruptions began. They show how the gases spread. They reveal the connection between the volcanic activity and the changes in the atmosphere. This evidence is more than a clue. It is a timeline of the transformation that was beginning. As the eruptions continued, the effects spread across the world. The air became thicker with volcanic gases. The sun's light was filtered through clouds of ash and dust. The land grew warmer, the oceans grew more acidic. The balance that had supported life for millions of years was shifting. The first tremors from deep below were the signals of a larger change. They were the beginning of a geological event that would reshape the Earth. The magma rising beneath Siberia was more than a force of destruction. It was a force of transformation. It reshaped the land, the air, and the sea. It began the process that would mark the end of one world and prepare the way for another. The story of these volcanic eruptions is written in the rocks. It is captured in the chemical signatures that show the changes in the atmosphere. It is reflected in the spreading layers of hardened lava. These signs reveal the moment when the Earth began to shift from stability to crisis. The tremors from deep below marked the beginning of a new chapter in the planet's history. The world's greatest changes were now spreading far beyond the oceans and the shifting rivers. They were entering the air itself. Across the vast expanses of Pangea, something subtle and invisible was taking place. The atmosphere, which had always been the quiet and constant background of life, was beginning to change. It was no longer simply a mixture of gases that supported breathing and weather. It was becoming heavier with new substances. It was turning into a force that shaped the fate of every ecosystem. The earliest signals were slow. Carbon dioxide had always been part of the atmosphere. Plants used it to build their bodies. The oceans absorbed it and stored it in minerals and shells. But as the volcanic activity continued, more carbon dioxide entered the air. The balance that had allowed forests and marine life to thrive was shifting. The rise of carbon dioxide was not just a simple increase. It was happening faster than before. The Earth's systems that once could steady the atmosphere were now too strained to keep up. This increase in carbon dioxide did not spread evenly. It collected in the lower layers of the atmosphere first, where it trapped more heat. The air grew warmer. Rainfall patterns changed. Winds moved in new directions. The warmth from the rising carbon dioxide affected the land and the oceans at the same time. Plants that once thrived in cooler climates began to weaken. The forests that had been the lungs of the world were thinning. The air lost part of its ability to support the balance of life. Alongside the rise of carbon dioxide came another shift. Oxygen levels began to fall. The atmosphere had once held a generous supply of oxygen that allowed animals to grow larger and ecosystems to flourish. But now that supply was declining. The forests that once replenished the oxygen were shrinking. The oceans that had produced oxygen through tiny organisms were struggling under chemical stress. This fall in oxygen placed new challenges on the creatures that lived on land and in the water. Animals that had once breathed easily now faced thinner air. The line between survival and struggle grew sharper. Fossils from this time show changes in the bones and tissues of animals that lived in the Late Permian. Their bodies reveal signs of stress and adaptation. Some animals developed more efficient ways to breathe. Others grew smaller. Their metabolism shifted to cope with the new atmosphere. While carbon dioxide and oxygen shifted, another group of substances spread across the world. The volcanic eruptions had produced clouds of ash and sulfur compounds. These particles mixed with the air and traveled across entire continents. They dimmed the sunlight in some regions and warmed the atmosphere in others. The sulfur compounds reacted with water in the air and produced acids. When this fell as rain, it altered the chemistry of the soil. Plants that had been rooted in the earth for thousands of years were exposed to substances that weakened them. The ash from the volcanic eruptions settled on land and sea. It formed layers in the sediment. It carried the signature of the volcanic gases and minerals. In some places, the ash formed thick blankets over the ground. In others, it mixed with the soil and changed its composition. These changes affected the plants that depended on specific minerals. They also changed how water moved through the soil. Even a light layer of ash could block seeds from growing or reflect heat that dried the ground. As the carbon dioxide continued to rise and the oxygen continued to fall, the atmosphere began to enter a feedback loop. The warming of the air increased the evaporation of water. The drying of the land reduced the growth of plants. The reduction of plants meant less carbon was taken out of the air. The cycle continued. Each change strengthened the next. The earth tried to maintain balance, but the systems that were once strong enough to control the atmosphere were now weakened. These feedback loops were not immediate. They unfolded over thousands of years, but the signs of change were becoming clearer. The air was turning into a mixture that supported less life. The volcanic gases added heat. The rising carbon dioxide trapped that heat. The falling oxygen made the world more difficult to inhabit. The ash and sulfur compounds traveled across the sky, creating clouds that carried the signal of geological events across the world. Paleontologists and geologists can see these changes in ancient rocks and ice. They find layers that contain the fingerprints of the changing air. The chemical mixtures reveal how the atmosphere was shifting. The evidence is more than a clue. It is a record of transformation that reached into every corner of the earth. The sky that once moved with the gentle flow of wind now carried more than clouds. It held the weight of a world that was changing from within. The atmosphere that had been a source of stability for millions of years was entering a new phase. It reflected the deep changes taking place below and above the land. The balance of gases continued to shift. The air itself was becoming something different. It was no longer simply a place where life breathed freely. It was becoming a powerful force that shaped the future of every creature that walked, swam, or flew across the ancient world. The oceans had always been a cradle for living things. Long before forests covered the land, or great rivers carved their paths across continents, life had begun in water. The seas had been a refuge where life could move, feed, and grow in a world that was constantly changing. But now the oceans were shifting in a way that turned them from sanctuary into something more uncertain. The water was no longer simply a home for life. It was becoming a source of danger. Deep beneath the surface, the water had already begun to change. It held less oxygen than before. The dark and still layers that once stayed far below the reach of sunlight were rising. This deep water had always been a place where few creatures lived, a region of cold and pressure where bacteria broke down the remains of life. Now those deep layers were moving upward, closer to the places where fish swam and corals grew. The boundaries in the water were shifting. These deep water layers were not just low in oxygen, they held chemicals that were usually kept far from the surface. One of the most important of these chemicals was hydrogen sulfide, a gas that is toxic to most life. In small amounts, it can be broken down or diluted, but as the oceans continued to warm and the currents weakened, the hydrogen sulfide began to rise. Scientists can see evidence of this in the rocks that formed at the bottom of ancient seas. They find layers that contain minerals formed from hydrogen sulfide. They find fossils of creatures that died suddenly, as if poisoned by the water. These signals reveal the changes that were happening. The gas that once stayed deep below was now spreading upward. It drifted into the places where marine life was most abundant. The rising of hydrogen sulfide shows that the ocean was no longer able to support the balance that had kept life safe for so long. The water that had once carried oxygen to deep currents was now stagnant. The movement of the ocean slowed. The heat from the atmosphere warmed the surface. The colder layers below did not mix as they used to. Without these currents, the ocean began to behave like a still pond. The chemical layers became sharper and more dangerous. The creatures that lived in the ocean felt these changes. The fish that swam near the surface began to disappear from some regions. Their fossils show sudden gaps that are not explained by movement or migration. The coral like organisms that built reefs struggled to survive. Their skeletons show signs of weakening, thinning, and dissolving. The shells of ancient sea creatures show irregular growth. These changes reflect the chemical shifts in the ocean. As the hydrogen sulfide rose, the marine world began to break apart. The zones where fish could breathe grew smaller. The places where corals could build their structures became fewer. The shell builders that depended on minerals in the water found it harder to grow. Many of these creatures could not move fast enough to escape. They were trapped in waters that had become hostile. The evidence of these changes is clear in the seafloor sediments. Paleontologists find layers where fossils are scarce. They find sudden drops in the number of species. They see the remains of animals that died in large numbers. These sediments tell the story of a world where life was pushed into smaller and smaller spaces. The creatures that once filled the seas now struggled to find places to survive. The rising hydrogen sulfide also affected the atmosphere. When the gas reached the surface, it could enter the air. It created a connection between the ocean and the climate. The changes in the sea became part of the story of the land. The air carried the signals of the ocean's transformation. It moved the gases across the world. It changed the patterns of weather and temperature. The coral-like organisms that had built reefs for millions of years were among the first to disappear. Their delicate skeletons were sensitive to changes in temperature and chemistry. As the water became warmer and more acidic, they could no longer grow. Their reefs broke apart. Their fossils reveal how the reefs collapsed and how the creatures that depended on them vanished. The fish that once swam in the open water also faced challenges. They needed oxygen to survive, but as the deep water rose, the oxygen levels fell. The fish could not always escape to new regions. The currents that might have carried them to safety were weaker. Their fossils show the story of species that once thrived, now struggling to survive. The shell builders also faced the decline of minerals in the water. The carbonate levels had already begun to fall. The acidity of the water had increased. These changes made it difficult for shells to form. The fossils show shells that are thin, cracked, and incomplete. These signs reveal how the ancient seas were turning against life. As each life form disappeared, it changed the balance of the ocean. The predators lost their prey. The prey lost their food sources. The ocean's web of life began to fall apart. The waters that had once been filled with movement and abundance now held silence. The ocean was not just changing, it was becoming a place where survival was a struggle. The transformation of the ocean was a quiet one. It unfolded beneath the surface. It spread through the currents. It touched the creatures that lived in the deep and the ones that swam near the light. The ocean that had once been a cradle for life was turning into a force that reshaped the future of the world. Across the land, a new kind of silence settled over the forests. These were once the tallest and oldest of Earth's communities. Their roots had reached into the soil for millions of years. Their branches had spread across the sky and held the rain like a net of green. They had survived storms and droughts and the rise and fall of continents. But now they were entering a time of rapid change. The stability that had allowed them to grow for ages was slipping away. The collapse of the forest began slowly, then gathered speed until it could not be stopped. The first sign was the disappearance of certain kinds of trees. These were the species that depended on steady rainfall and deep soil. Their leaves began to dry, their growth slowed. When scientists study the fossil pollen from this period, they see sudden shifts in plant populations. Pollen from ancient forests becomes scarce. In its place appear the pollen grains of smaller, tougher plants. This reveals how the forest communities were already changing. Plants that once covered vast areas began to die in large numbers. These were not isolated events, they happened across wide regions. Trees that had stood for centuries withstood one drought, then another, then another. Their roots no longer found enough water. The soil around them hardened. The leaves fell and did not return. With each passing season, the die-offs accelerated. When the trees began to fall, their loss affected the soil beneath them. Forests had always protected the ground. Their roots held the soil in place. Their fallen leaves turned into nutrients. Without the trees, the soil had no shelter. Wind and heat dried it quickly. The ground began to turn to dust. Once the soil became dust, it began to move. The wind carried it across the land. It filled the air and settled in the valleys. It covered young plants that were trying to grow. The dust made it harder for seeds to take root. What had once been fertile earth became a layer of loose particles. The soil that had taken millions of years to form was now breaking apart. The fall of the forests also changed the temperature of the land. Trees had once cooled the air and kept the climate steady. Without them, the heat became more intense. The ground absorbed more sunlight. The forests that remained were exposed to higher temperatures. This increased the number of trees that dried and died. The cycle pushed itself forward. With the loss of the forests came a new threat. Wildfires that had once been rare began to spread more easily. Dry leaves and branches provided fuel. The wind carried sparks across the land. Fires moved through the weakened forests with growing speed. They burned not just the surface but the roots. They consumed the soil itself. The fires burned hotter and longer than before. Geological evidence shows layers of ash that settled across the land during this time. These layers contain charcoal and minerals from burned wood. The presence of these layers reveals how common the fires became. They were no longer brief events. They became a regular part of the changing climate. With each fire, the forests lost more ground. The loss of forests did not only affect the land, it affected the air and the water. Trees had once taken carbon from the atmosphere and returned oxygen. As they disappeared, the balance of gases shifted further. Carbon levels continued to rise. Oxygen continued to fall. The world was becoming warmer and more difficult for life to breathe. The forests that had been the Earth's lungs were no longer able to protect the planet. The disappearance of trees also changed how water moved across the land. Without forests to slow the rain, the water ran quickly over the surface. It carried away soil and minerals. It created floods in some regions and droughts in others. The rivers that were already failing now received more sediment. Their paths shifted again. This series of changes created a chain reaction. The fall of the forests made the land more vulnerable. The loss of soil weakened the plants that remained. The fires destroyed the ground. The atmosphere grew more stressed. The ecosystems that relied on shade and moisture began to disappear. Animals that once lived among the trees faced new challenges. They were forced to move or adapt. The collapse of the forests also changed the behavior of insects and smaller creatures. Some species lost their food sources. Others found new opportunities in the weakened trees. Fossils show marks where insects burrowed into dying wood. They reveal how even the smallest creatures were affected by the forest's decline. As the forests continued to fall, the landscape changed. What had once been covered in green now became a patchwork of bare ground and scattered trees. The patterns of life shifted. The forests that had been a symbol of stability were no longer strong. Their fall reflected the larger changes that were spreading across the world. The collapse of the forests was not a single moment. It was a process that unfolded over thousands of years. It moved through the land like a quiet wave. Each season brought new changes. Each year saw more trees fall. The forests that had anchored the ecosystems of Pangea were now entering their final chapter. Their collapse revealed how deeply the earth was changing. It showed how the loss of one part of the world could reshape the whole. The forests had once been a refuge. They had protected the land, but now their loss was shaping a new future. The earth was entering a phase where the familiar landscapes of the past were disappearing. The forests were no longer a stable world. They were part of a planet drifting toward a deeper transformation. For millions of years, life had built its intricate patterns across the land and sea. Predator and prey, forests and rivers, reefs and shallow seas. Every living thing had been part of a larger web. Each creature relied on something else. Plants fed herbivores. Herbivores fed predators. Scavengers and decomposers returned nutrients to the soil or into the currents of the ocean. It had been a balance formed slowly over time, but now this balance was reaching a point where it could no longer hold. The earlier changes had weakened the foundations of these webs. Forests had thinned, rivers had shrunk, the oceans had become warm and still. The creatures that once thrived in these environments found fewer resources. The food webs began to fray. At first, the unraveling was local, tied to a region or a specific habitat, but soon these struggles spread across wider areas. The world was becoming more fragile. For many herbivores, the greatest challenge was finding enough food. The grasses that once grew along the floodplains were disappearing. The trees that had provided leaves and bark were drying. The plants that remained were scattered and weaker. The herbivores that had moved across the land in search of vegetation now found only patches of growth. Their bodies show signs of stress. The fossil record reveals their shrinking size and thinning bones. These signs reflect a world where food was no longer reliable. In this weakened state, herbivores had to compete more directly with each other. Herds that once shared space now struggled for the same feed. Smaller animals moved more often to avoid the larger ones. Some herbivores changed their diets or searched for food in new areas, but these changes could not always keep them alive. Their decline marked an early stage of the unraveling. As the herbivores faltered, the predators that depended on them faced their own challenges. Predators had always been adaptable. They had survived drought, climate shifts, and changes in prey. But now the decline of herbivores meant their own paths were threatened. The fossils of predator species reveal the marks of hunger. Their bones show signs of malnutrition. Their teeth reflect a change in diet or the desperate attempts to hunt new prey. The predators followed the last herds across the land. They hunted near the final watering places, but there were fewer animals to hunt. The fossil record shows this shift clearly. The remains of predators become fewer. The layers of sediment show fewer teeth and bones. This reflects a collapse in their populations. Some predators became smaller, others vanished from regions where they had once been common. The final stage of the unraveling was spreading. As predators and herbivores declined, the ecosystems that depended on them began to fall into silence. The scavengers that fed on the remains of animals had fewer sources of food. The decomposers that broke down plant and animal material faced changes in the soil. The insects that lived in the weakened forests faced their own challenges. The entire web was showing signs of strain. Ecosystems that had once been filled with movement now felt the absence of life. The rivers that once held fish and amphibians now ran clearer, reflecting empty water. The plains that had been covered in grasses and herds became dry and quiet. The forests that had stood tall became scattered with empty trunks and broken branches. The sounds of life faded. The unraveling was not a sudden event. It did not happen in a single year or even a single generation. It unfolded across thousands of years. But each change made the next one more likely. With fewer herbivores, the plants that remained could not spread their seeds or pollinate effectively. With fewer predators, certain species might have grown unchecked, but the collapse of vegetation removed this possibility. The balance that once defined the world was no longer possible. The loss of one part of the ecosystem created a ripple effect. It moved through the population slowly at first, then more quickly. The food webs had reached a point where a single missing link could change the paths of many others. The collapse was not only the loss of individual species, it was the loss of connections between them. In the fossil record, paleontologists find layers where life is present. Above those layers, they find others where the diversity falls sharply. These layers tell the story of ecosystems falling into silence. They show the moment when food webs reached their limit. They show the moment when the balance tipped. The land and sea were no longer able to support the webs of life that had once covered the world. The connections between species were breaking. The final unraveling was a gradual fading away. It was the quiet retreat of ancient ecosystems that had lasted for millions of years. The silence that spread across the world was a reflection of these changes. It was the absence of movement, of voices, of life. The ecosystems that had been a symphony of interactions were now losing their harmony. The last calls of predators, the last movements of grazing herds, the last growth of ancient forests were becoming rare. The world that had once been filled with abundance was now becoming something different. It was a place where the final unraveling of life had begun. The ancient web that had supported countless generations was reaching its final moments. The ecosystems that had shaped the world were falling into silence, one thread at a time. There comes a point in any long transformation when the changes are no longer scattered or slow. They draw together and form a single shape. They become something that no longer resembles the world that came before. The final moments before the great dying were not a single flash or a sudden break. They were the slow arrival of a world transformed almost beyond recognition. By now, the systems that had held the planet in balance for millions of years were fully destabilized. Every part of the world had been touched by the changes that crept across land and sea. None of these shifts happened in isolation. They were woven together, each one amplifying the next. The forests had thinned, rivers had dwindled, the oceans had darkened, the atmosphere had changed. Life was holding on, but only in scattered pockets and fading memories of what once had been. The oceans were now almost anoxic. The word simply means a lack of oxygen, but there is a deeper meaning held inside it. For most of Earth's history, oceans filled with oxygenated waters had supported reefs, fish, and the delicate chains of life that linked the surface to the deep. Without oxygen, those chains break apart. Whole regions of water now lay still and breathless. The currents that once carried nutrients and life between the shallows and the abyss had grown weak, warmed by the changing climate and altered by the chemistry of volcanic gases. The oceans held their breath. Near the coasts, the last marine creatures remained in shrinking refuges. They hovered in the thin, shallow band where oxygen still lingered. They moved slowly through waters that no longer felt safe. In deeper regions, the silence was complete. The ocean floor held the still remains of animals that had been unable to find safe water. Their bones and shells settled into dark sediments that would one day tell this story in quiet detail. The deeper waters had become heavy with hydrogen sulfide and other gases that once had been held far from the surface. The ocean was no longer a cradle for life. It was a place of growing vulnerability. The atmosphere above these oceans was different too. The composition of the air had changed. The ratio of gases was unlike anything the world had known for millions of years. Carbon dioxide had climbed, oxygen had fallen. The sky carried ash and sulfur from distant eruptions. Clouds of fine dust and particles drifted across continents. These changes touched every breath, every leaf, every drop of rain. This altered atmosphere was not just a sign of change, it was part of a feedback loop that had become nearly impossible to slow. Warmer air meant less moisture for the land. Less vegetation meant fewer ways to pull carbon from the sky. The heat grew stronger. The air grew thinner. The cycle continued. It was a loop that fed itself, turning the planet into something new. The land above this atmosphere was a patchwork of ecosystems that were hanging by a thread. The forests that once covered the plains were nearly gone. The soil was fragile and easily disturbed. Herds of animals that had wandered the land for countless generations were now scattered and thin. Predators searched for prey that was no longer plentiful. The rhythms of the seasons had become unpredictable. Floods came too quickly or not at all. Temperatures swung between extremes. Life continued, but only in fragments. There were places that still held pockets of stability. These were the last refuges where plants found moisture in deep soil or shadows. Rivers carved narrow paths through dry lands. Coastal winds carried cool air from the sea. But these strongholds were smaller than ever. They were surrounded by landscapes hollowed out by change. They could not hold back the transformation that had reached into every corner of the world. The Earth's geological systems also showed the marks of this final moment. The land trembled under the weight of the rising magma from below. The volcanic provinces that were forming continued to spread. The crust shifted. The land itself was changing shape. Ash settled over regions far from the source of the eruptions. The atmosphere carried the signals of change across the world. Everything was connected. Each change pushed the next forward. The ocean's chemistry altered the atmosphere. The atmosphere changed the climate. The climate shifted the land. The land changed the water. The water shifted the life within it. The planet held all of these pieces together, but now those connections were stretched to their breaking point. The world in these final moments was not a world of dramatic events or explosive endings. It was a world of quiet tension. It was a world seconds before collapse, the silence before a vast and irreversible turning. The last systems that held life in place were unraveling. The earth stood on the threshold between the ancient world and the new one that would rise after the great dying. This moment did not look like an ending. It looked like a world still holding on. The winds still moved. The seas still touched the shore. Plants still reached for light. Animals still searched for food. Life was present everywhere, but it was fragile. It was stretched thin. The final transformation was close. The planet was poised, suspended between what had been and what was about to arrive. When we look back at this ancient world, it can feel impossibly distant. The continents were arranged differently. The oceans were warmer and stranger. The air was a different mix of gases. The creatures that walked the land or swam through the seas bore little resemblance to anything alive today. Yet there is something in this story that resonates across time. The Permian was not just a vanished chapter, it was a mirror held up to the future, a moment when the Earth showed what can happen when the balance of the planet is pushed too far. One of the lessons carried forward from this era lies in the idea of climate thresholds. Throughout Earth's history, the climate has changed many times. There have been ice ages and warm periods, times of abundant life and times of scarcity. But the Permian stands apart because its changes crossed thresholds that did not simply alter the world, they transformed it. Temperatures rose slowly at first. then more quickly. Weather patterns that had once been stable became unpredictable. Rainfall did not fall where it once had. The land heated and dried. The seas warmed and lost their oxygen. These changes did not unfold as single events. They came together and built upon one another. Scientists today use the word threshold to describe a point at which a system no longer responds gently to pressure. Instead, the system shifts abruptly into a new state. The Permian shows us how these thresholds can behave. The shifts were small at first, a little warming, slight changes in rainfall, a gradual loss of forest cover. But once the planet crossed a critical line, the changes accelerated. Entire ecosystems became unstable. The oceans drifted into dangerous chemistry. The atmosphere altered in ways that were difficult to reverse. This era reminds us that environmental tipping points are not just scientific ideas, they are real features of the Earth. They are lines that cannot be crossed without consequences. When systems are pushed, they respond. Sometimes they respond slowly, sometimes they react violently. The Permian tells us that the Earth can change in profound ways when these tipping points are reached. There is another reason this era matters. The Great Dying was not only an ecological collapse, it was also an evolutionary reset. The loss of life was almost total. Species that had dominated the land and sea for millions of years vanished. Entire families of animals disappeared from the fossil record, but life did not end. It reshaped itself. From the silence that followed, new forms emerged. The ancestors of mammals, the earliest archosaurs, the seeds of future worlds. Life has a remarkable ability to begin again. Yet the recovery from the Permian took an immense amount of time. It was not measured in thousands of years, or even in millions. The ecosystems of the Earth needed tens of millions of years to rebuild. The oceans took that long to recover their oxygen. Forests needed that time to grow back. The land needed that time to form new soils. The lesson held in that span is quiet and enduring. The Earth can heal, but the healing happens on the scale of geological time. Some of the creatures that arose in the aftermath of this collapse would go on to shape the world we know today. The lineage that would one day lead to mammals began among the survivors. The roots of future ecosystems were carried forward by small, unassuming species that held on through the darkest moment in Earth's biological history. If the world had not collapsed, our own story would be different. The life that rose from the Permian's ashes opened a pathway that eventually led to our distant ancestors. This history is not only a lesson in vulnerability, it is also a lesson in endurance. The Permian extinction was the closest Earth has ever come to losing everything. Yet life persisted. It adapted. It found ways to survive in landscapes that were nearly unrecognizable. It reminds us that life is resilient. Even when the planet is pushed to its limits, the story continues. There is one final thread connecting that ancient world to our lives today. The changes we see in our own time echo with familiar patterns. Climate is shifting, oceans are warming, some species are disappearing at rates that draw comparisons to ancient events. Scientists watch for early signs of instability. They measure the atmosphere and the sea. They look for the same thresholds that were crossed long ago. We are not living in the Permian. Our world is unique and shaped by different forces. Yet the memory of that age remains as a quiet reminder of what can happen when the balance of the earth is strained. The rocks and fossils do not speak in warnings or instructions. They speak in evidence. They show us the traces of a world transformed by change. They show us the edges of resilience, and they show that the earth carries its history forward. The story of the Permian does not belong only to the deep past, it belongs to the future, it belongs to us. As our journey through this forgotten age draws to a gentle pause, We stand with the world just moments before its greatest transformation. We have watched forests fade and oceans darken. We have followed the rivers during their last breaths and walked across the ancient deserts that once stretched for unbroken distances. We have moved through ecosystems that struggled to hold themselves together under the weight of subtle pressures that grew stronger with each passing age. We have seen thresholds crossed and balances tipped. Now we rest on the final edge of this story, where the earth grew quiet and waited. There is something profound about this silence. It does not speak in fear or alarm. It is the stillness that comes before change. The planet had always carried its own rhythms. Seas rose and fell, continents drifted, life adapted to new conditions. Yet here in the late Permian, the silence was different. It held the weight of the entire world in a delicate balance. The great forests had thinned, the rivers had nearly vanished. The air itself had shifted so far from what it had once been that the breath of creatures grew strained. The oceans hovered close to a place where life could no longer find refuge. Every system of the planet leaned into a fragile equilibrium. We often think of Earth as a place of permanence. Mountains appear immovable, oceans seem endless. Yet this story reminds us that even the greatest natural forces are part of a living planet. They rise and fall with time. They react to change. They hold power, not because they are fixed, but because they are always in motion. The earth is resilient, but that resilience carries limits. When those limits were reached in the Permian, the world shifted into a state that no creature from earlier ages could survive. Reflecting on this moment encourages us to see the planet not as a stable backdrop to life, but as a participant in its history. The atmosphere breathes, the oceans circulate like blood, the land reshapes itself with slow determination. Every part of the earth interacts with every other part, creating patterns that stretch across millions of years. In the Permian, these patterns hit a point where they could no longer support the life that had grown upon them. What followed was not sudden in the way a storm might break across a coastline. It was slow, patient, and complete. The earth stepped into its next chapter. There is a quiet strength in the planet's story. It has endured impacts and floods and ice. It has seen the rise and fall of creatures stranger and older than anything we might imagine today. Through each transformation, it has found a way to continue. Life has always recovered. Forests have returned. Seas have filled again with movement and sound. Yet each recovery has taken time beyond human measure. The world always rebuilds itself, but never in haste. As we reach the end of this chapter together, take a moment to hold the quiet weight of what we have seen, not with worry, but with wonder. This age speaks not only of endings, but of beginnings. From the collapse of one world came the seeds of another, the ancestors of mammals, the early forms that would lead to the age of dinosaurs. Eventually, the rise of creatures that would shape the planet in unexpected ways. Our lineage is tied to this moment. Without the silence that closed the Permian, none of the chapters that followed could ever have been written. The earth carries its history through every breath of wind and every grain of sand. It teaches us that the world is both powerful and delicate, that the systems of life depend on a balance that can be shifted, that change is inevitable, yet not meaningless. The Permian reminds us that our planet is always writing its story. We are part of that story too. If you have felt a quiet connection to this journey, or simply enjoyed drifting through this ancient world, I would be grateful if you left a gentle like or subscribed. It helps this small corner of science find its way to those who might need a moment of calm. And if you wish, share where you are watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now breathe in softly. Let the sound of the world fall away. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of a planet on the brink. And as we close this chapter, remember something simple and true. Earth is fragile, yet enduring. It is always moving, always changing, always alive. Good night, friends.